A desperate voice echoed through the room, crying out for Katie. Exhausted but beaming, Katie presented their newborn daughter to Wool, gently urging him to hold her. Cradling the infant, Katie suggested the name Louise and asked for his thoughts on the choice. Calling the name lovely and perfect, Wool experienced a sudden, overwhelming rush as his past life memories flooded back into his mind. Staring at his beloved newborn daughter, he realized the terrifying truth of her identity. He recognized baby Louise as the infamous villainess of a world he once knew, determined now to fight against her dark destiny. The sprawling, majestic kingdom of Bernard stood as the setting for this newly remembered reality. Peace in this land relied entirely on powerful barriers shielding towns from the 39 dungeons and their relentless monster threats. This dangerous world was actually the setting of the popular otome game Azure Maiden's Fantasia, commonly known to fans as Alphon. Revealing his true identity, Wolfgang Malleus Sonter stood as the acting head of House Lehrmann, a powerful ducal family of Bernard. Accepting his bizarre fate, Wolfgang confirmed his reincarnation into the game's universe specifically as the doomed villainess's father. Recalling his past life, he remembered being an all-genre gamer who relentlessly played everything, including niche otome titles. He reminisced about Alphon's core premise, which centered on a standard romance where the heroine courted a cast of handsome suitors. However, the game truly distinguished itself through its unexpectedly complex and challenging dungeon-crawling mechanics. Drawn in initially by the combat, he eventually became hooked on the story, regretting only that he hadn't bought more merchandise. In the game, players guided the pure-hearted Saintess Monica across the land, balancing rigorous training with romantic pursuits. Monica's ultimate objective required her to quell the vicious monster rampages erupting from the kingdom's many dungeons. Tragically, Wolfgang's own daughter Louise was destined to become Monica's bitter rival for the Crown Prince's affections. This rivalry invariably ended with the prince brutally breaking off his engagement to Louise and permanently banishing her from the kingdom. Staring grimly into the future, Wolfgang acknowledged that his precious daughter was fated for an absolute downfall as the story's villainess. Snapped back to the chaotic present, Wolfgang realized he had no time for exposition as young Louise threw a massive tantrum. Screaming in pure defiance, the distressed child completely rejected her father's comfort while he sighed helplessly. Crouching to her level, Wolfgang desperately pleaded with Lulu to calm down and explain what was causing her so much pain. Instead of answering, the crying girl shrieked a deafening refusal before suddenly winding up a fierce physical strike. Tears streaming down her face, Louise screamed for her mother as she unleashed her childish fury. The devastating reason for her meltdown was the recent, tragic death of her mother Cassandra due to a sudden epidemic. Rubbing his battered face, Wolfgang sharply told his concerned servants to drop the young master title after enduring the painful blow. Laughing off the surprising strength of a child's punch, he apologized to his equally exhausted and disheveled staff. Ignoring his earlier command, a solemn servant addressed him by the forbidden title once again, prompting an annoyed sigh from Wolfgang. The servant gently noted that the grieving little girl was still entirely unable to process or accept Lady Cassandra's untimely death. Suggesting a tactical retreat, the staff advised giving the heartbroken child some much-needed space to cool down. Rejecting their advice instantly, Wolfgang silently vowed to keep the sacred promise he made to Katie to always be there for their daughter. Reflecting on his knowledge, he knew the original in-game Wolfgang had coldly distanced himself from the grieving child, as was customary for nobles. Armed with his reincarnated memories from the moment of her birth, he firmly rejected his programmed fate and chased after his daughter. The desperate father immediately launched into a frantic search across the estate to track down his runaway child. Pausing to catch his breath, he frantically scanned the area, knowing she wouldn't wander far from the manor grounds on her own. Trusting his parental instincts, he suddenly pivoted and realized that she might be hiding in the garden. His heart ached as he remembered how incredibly young and vulnerable his 4-year-old daughter truly was. Spotting her small figure, he realized the sheer depth of the loneliness and confusion caused by her mother's sudden passing. Reaching the young girl at last, he prepared to comfort her through the profound grief of losing her mother. Stepping into the chilly garden, Wolfgang finally located his daughter and expressed immense relief that she was safe. Approaching her gently, he remarked with a soft voice that her mother had also cherished this peaceful spot. Urging her to return inside, he mentioned Christoph's growing worry and the dropping temperature. Louise stubbornly refused to move, screaming that she never wanted to return to a house without her mother. Startled by the raw intensity of her outburst, Wolfgang stumbled backward in shock. Overwhelmed by his own suppressed grief, tears suddenly spilled from his eyes as his daughter watched in stunned silence. He collapsed heavily to his knees, burying his face in his hands as he wept openly in the garden. Between his heavy sobs, he confessed to the young girl that losing Cassandra hurt him just as deeply. He realized in that moment that the political nature of their marriage and the reality of this world being a game meant absolutely nothing. Gripped by overwhelming sorrow, he questioned the cruel fate that had so suddenly torn his family apart. Vivid memories of her joyful voice flooded his mind, proving how deeply and truly he had fallen in love with her. He agonized over the crushing realization that he and Lulu would never see her radiant smile again. The painful truth settled over him that the days filled with her bright, sunflower-like smiles were gone forever. Unable to contain his heartbreak, the once stoic Duke continued to cry freely before his bewildered young daughter. Apologizing softly for his sudden breakdown, he looked up in surprise as Lulu gently approached him. Staring at his tear-stained face, Louise softly admitted her mistaken belief that he hadn't been sad at all. She confessed how deeply she had misunderstood his feelings regarding her mother's tragic passing. She explained that his complete lack of tears at the funeral had convinced her of his cold indifference. Calming himself, Wolfgang gently asked if she remembered the massive crowd that had attended the Samba event. He carefully explained that not everyone in attendance had good intentions, surprising the young girl. To protect their house from scheming nobles, he revealed that as acting duke, he couldn't afford to show any weakness publicly. Acknowledging how cold his composed act must have looked, he clarified that it was strictly a facade to prevent his enemies from causing trouble. Smiling gently through his remaining tears, he reassured her that she didn't need to understand these complex adult duties just yet. Shifting the heavy mood, he excitedly asked if she wanted to see a secret room, instantly sparking her curiosity. While helping him search for his glasses, Louise sweetly apologized for knocking them away earlier during her tantrum. He securely placed his glasses back onto his face, signaling a fresh start and a restored bond between father and daughter. Pushing open the heavy wooden doors, he revealed the hidden room, leaving Louise completely awestruck. The dimly lit, expansive chamber was filled to the brim with countless canvases and artist supplies. Looking around the grand gallery, the young girl marveled aloud that beautiful portraits of her mother were everywhere. Regretting his delay, Wolfgang admitted he should have brought her here sooner but had been too embarrassed by his hobby. Tilting her head in pure confusion, Louise innocently questioned why he would ever feel embarrassed about something so wonderful. Scratching his cheek sheepishly, he confessed that he was the actual artist behind every single painting in the room. Astonished by the grand revelation, she excitedly asked for confirmation, which he proudly provided. Staring at the massive, loving collection of her mother's portraits, Louise whispered in pure amazement. Deflecting her heartfelt praise with humble modesty, he insisted that his artistic skills weren't actually that impressive. Gazing lovingly at the painted faces, Louise smiled and noted that the warm room made it feel like her mother was still home with them. Hearing her comforting words, Wolfgang looked down at his precious daughter with a tender, deeply relieved expression. Showing her his very first piece, he chuckled about his lack of improvement while casually mentioning his long-standing love for painting since a past life. Recalling a fond memory, he remembered Katie playfully claiming ownership of a portrait simply because she was the lovely subject. Smiling brightly at the memory, he generously offered Louise the chance to pick one to hang in her own room, making her beam with absolute joy. Scanning the vast collection, Louise hummed in thought as she pondered which painting to choose. Wolfgang suggested a miniature canvas that she could easily carry with her wherever she went. Struck by inspiration, he realized a small locket pendant would be an even better choice. While Wolfgang muttered about the logistics of crafting a tiny portrait of the two, the young girl cheerfully requested one for herself. Tilting her head, she innocently asked why he didn't make a painting of himself alongside her mother. Rubbing his neck, Wolfgang sheepishly explained the immense difficulty of painting himself into the picture. Undeterred by the challenge, Louise eagerly demanded a portrait featuring both of her beloved parents. Agreeing with a warm smile, he warned her not to complain since he famously struggled with self-portraits. Softening his tone, Wolfgang gently called his daughter's name. He carefully reminded her that while she had apologized to him, there were others who deserved her apologies too. Acknowledging his gentle scolding, she agreed as he instructed her to meet him in his study afterward. Nodding obediently, the young girl spun around and happily jogged off to fulfill her duty. Later in the quiet study, Christoph gracefully entered and offered Wolfgang a fresh cup of coffee. Accepting the warm beverage with gratitude, Wolfgang listened as the butler fondly reported on the young Mrs. heartfelt apology tour. Wolfgang apologized for the physical toll his daughter's grieving tantrums had taken on the staff, but Christoph stoically dismissed it as their noble duty. Rejecting the cold detachment typical of nobility, Wolfgang firmly stated his desire for a peaceful, emotionally open household. Shifting the conversation, Christoph knowingly brought up the secret memory room Wolfgang had finally revealed to his daughter. Staring thoughtfully into his cup, Wolfgang admitted she loved the space and regretted not sharing it with her much earlier. Chuckling at Wolfgang's renewed annoyance over his childhood title, Christoph playfully noted that the young master seemed to have finally found his own peace. Suddenly lost in memory, Wolfgang recalled a quiet, intimate moment with his late wife. In the melancholic flashback, a sickly Katie gently acknowledged his arrival at her bedside. Brushing off his own immense fatigue, Wolfgang anxiously interrogated her about her rest and meals. Staring back with deep concern, Katie scolded him softly for constantly pushing himself too hard. Deflecting her worry, he stubbornly insisted he was fine while she immediately called out his obvious lie. Smiling weakly, she confessed her haunting fear that he would completely shatter and follow her into death. Reaching out to touch his face, she affectionately teased him for being such a crybaby whenever they were alone. Her voice growing faint, Katie gently beckoned her weeping husband closer to her resting form. Looking deeply into his eyes, she prepared to ask him for one final, crucial favor. With absolute conviction, she pleaded with him to never abandon their daughter after she passed away. Wolfgang begged her to stop talking about death as she desperately reminded him of their precious child's need for love. Clinging to shattered dreams, he tearfully recalled their broken promise of a simple springtime family picnic. Gripping her hands, he mourned the stolen future where they were supposed to watch their daughter grow up side by side. Staring up at his heartbroken face, Katie whispered his name with infinite tenderness. With her remaining strength, she entrusted him with the sacred duty of protecting their little girl. She hammered home the agonizing reality that he would soon be Lulu's only surviving parent. Breaking down completely, Wolfgang swore a solemn, unbreakable vow to protect their daughter forever. Locking eyes one last time, Katie demanded a final, binding promise from the depths of his soul. Snapped back to the present, Wolfgang warmly welcomed his daughter as she joyfully burst into his study. Beaming with immense pride, Louise proudly announced that she had successfully apologized to the entire staff. Turning to the butler, the sweet child offered a sincere and adorable apology for her previous violent outbursts. Clenching her little fists, she excitedly declared her new ambition to study hard so she could help her father. Smiling at her boundless energy, Wolfgang silently thanked his late wife while praising their daughter's rapid growth. Rewarding her brave efforts, Wolfgang offered her a refreshing glass of juice specially prepared by Christoph. Snatching the drink with greedy delight, Louise happily thanked the smiling butler. Watching her drink, Wolfgang stared deeply at the living, breathing legacy of his beloved wife. His eyes hardened with fierce resolve as he swore to completely obliterate her destined path of ruin. Remembering his sacred vow, he gently called his precious daughter back into his arms. Embracing her tightly, Wolfgang made an absolute, silent declaration that he would never allow their daughter to become a villainess. Fast-forwarding 2 years, a 6-year-old Louise officially began her rigorous education to become a proper young lady. Following a maid's strict instructions, Louise clumsily attempted to approach her seat from the left as she practiced her etiquette. Settling into her chair with a proud little smile, the young girl successfully completed her seating practice. Interrupting the lesson, Marcus abruptly called out his older brother, loudly mocking Wolfgang's disgustingly doting expression. Wolfgang internally introduced the 17-year-old Marcus as his much younger brother, dryly noting that the teen spoiled Louise just as much as he did. Recalling the tragic loss of their parents 11 years prior, Wolfgang fiercely defended his protective nature over his only remaining family. Clearing his throat to shift the mood, Marcus demanded his brother act seriously as he had come to ask a specific favor. Instantly anticipating the request, Wolfgang flatly denied his brother, warning him to drop the subject if it concerned the title succession. Ignoring Marcus's frustrated outburst, Wolfgang firmly reiterated that he was only serving as acting duke until the rightful heir could take over. Reminding his younger brother of the plan, Wolfgang explained he would relinquish the Duke Regent title and return to being a count once Marcus turned 18. Staring down the anxious teenager, Wolfgang stated that Marcus already knew exactly why this succession arrangement was absolute. Dropping his gaze, Marcus bitterly acknowledged the painful reason their late parents had chosen him over his older brother. Brushing past Marcus's defensive praise, Wolfgang bluntly admitted his complete inability to wield any form of magic. Accepting his societal flaw, Wolfgang noted that the kingdom's nobility was strictly expected to possess immense magical capabilities. Remembering his childhood, he recalled being falsely heralded as a holy prodigy due to his incredibly massive mana pool. However, despite that vast mana, he confessed his humiliating inability to cast even the simplest barrier spell by his 10th birthday. While Marcus fiercely praised Wolfgang's decade of flawless territorial management, Wolfgang maintained that their parents couldn't entrust the dukedom to a magic-less failure. Desperately pleading his case, Marcus argued that the citizens adored Wolfgang and would panic if a teenager suddenly seized control. Promising a gradual transition over several years, Wolfgang's reassurance was suddenly interrupted by Louise bursting joyfully into the room. Softening his stern demeanor instantly, Wolfgang warmly welcomed his daughter and asked if she had finished her studies. Catching her own informal slip, the young girl quickly corrected her posture and formally announced she had come to greet her uncle. Utterly defeated by her adorable etiquette, both the hardened duke and the anxious heir instantly melted into doting puddles. Curious about their conversation, Louise listened as Marcus excitedly praised her father's sheer brilliance despite his lack of magic. Tilting her head in profound confusion, the young girl questioned what her uncle meant by her father being unable to cast spells. While Louise argued that her father's flames had to be magic, Marcus explained the complex discovery of Wolfgang's special eyes during his student days. Elaborating on the phenomenon, Marcus revealed that Wolfgang possessed rare mystic eyes capable of igniting anything he simply willed to burn. Clenching his fists, the teenager expressed deep frustration that the kingdom refused to officially recognize these magical flames as true sorcery. Frowning at the unfairness, the young girl innocently questioned why anyone would deny such a spectacular power as magic. Adjusting his specialized glasses, Wolfgang explained he needed them to suppress his terrifying ability, noting that others found his gaze-ignited fires deeply unsettling. Struck by a sudden childhood epiphany, Louise tentatively suggested that her father simply fake casting the spells. Beaming with brilliant optimism, she reasoned that tricking the nobles would finally force them to recognize her father's greatness. Mimicking a grand spellcaster, she eagerly proposed he wield a magical rod just like the legendary wizards in her picture books. Stunned by the sheer simplicity of his daughter's logic, Wolfgang stood completely speechless. Catching onto the genius scheme, Marcus excitedly realized a convincing performance would easily pass for the silent magic of elite sorcerers. Weeping tears of overwhelming joy over his daughter's boundless support, Wolfgang ignored Marcus, demanding he pull himself together. Grounding the plan in reality, Marcus quickly pointed out the massive inconvenience of carrying a magical rod everywhere. Pivoting without missing a beat, the young girl enthusiastically recommended he trigger his flames by striking a super cool pose instead. While a deeply embarrassed Wolfgang frantically protested, Marcus loudly declared the official commencement of the pose designing committee. Flashing a fierce, conspiratorial grin, the younger brother enthusiastically backed his niece's theatrical master plan. Hyped by the possibility of revenge, Marcus loudly swore to humiliate every single fool who had ever mocked his brother's lack of magic. Flatly rejecting Marcus's proposal to immediately inherit the dukedom, Wolfgang ignored his younger brother's dramatic wailing. He reflected that in the original game storyline, his character took back the title and made Louise the duke's daughter. Convinced that avoiding the duke title would alter fate, he saw this as crucial resistance against Lulu's predetermined villainous route. Reassuring himself that Marcus would eventually become a splendid duke, Wolfgang spent the following days awkwardly practicing his magical pose. During a formal tea party shortly after, Marquise Müller enthusiastically praised the growing, stellar reputation of Zonta County. Countess Becker chimed in, marveling over a newly designed water pump capable of effortlessly drawing well water. Countess Voigt eagerly agreed, confirming that the incredible invention was the absolute talk of their own territory. Surrounded by the fiercely enthusiastic noblewomen, an overwhelmed Wolfgang could only offer a nervous, polite chuckle. Humbly attributing the pump to a lucky idea, he secretly thanked his past life memories for the sudden technological advancement. The women playfully scolded his modesty as they enjoyed the gathering celebrating Louise's invitation. Shifting the focus, young Emma politely asked her mother if the girls could go play in the garden. Madame Fisher happily granted permission but strictly warned the young ladies not to dirty their beautiful dresses. Waving a cheerful goodbye to her father, Lulu excitedly dashed off to enjoy the lush greenery with her friends. Watching them go, the gossiping noblewomen cooed over the adorable girls before whispering about Wolfgang's striking handsome features. Feeling completely out of place at a women's tea party, Wolfgang inwardly groaned about his intense, suffocating discomfort. He lamented his fate, having originally planned to kill time with Lord Fisher before Madame Fisher insisted he stay to watch Louise. Trapped at the elegant table, he awkwardly questioned how he ended up seated directly amidst the chattering ladies. The atmosphere shifted to a somber tone as the women recalled their deep worries following Lady Cassandra's tragic passing. Leaning in with gentle concern, they carefully asked if he had been terribly disheartened by the immense loss. They warmly confessed that everyone in noble society had deeply admired the profound, visible love shared between him and his late wife. Expressing quiet gratitude for their kind words, Wolfgang reassured them that he had finally found his footing after 2 difficult years. Pushing further, the women sympathetically pointed out that 6-year-old Louise must still feel incredibly lonely. Smiling with sly intent, they noted that Lord Zonta himself was still a very young, highly eligible bachelor. Instantly recognizing the thinly veiled pressure to remarry, Wolfgang mentally cursed himself for letting his guard down. Desperate to deflect the marriage talk, he quickly mentioned that his amateur paintings of Cassandra had greatly comforted his grieving daughter. Gasps of absolute delight erupted from the women as they discovered his secret hobby, making Wolfgang realize he had just dug his own grave. Attempting to dismiss his amateur artwork, he was completely overwhelmed when they enthusiastically demanded to hold the next tea party at his mansion. Suddenly, a piercing shriek shattered the peaceful garden atmosphere. A terrifying, massive flying monster abruptly swooped down from the clear sky. Before anyone could react, the beast violently snatched a screaming Emma in its sharp, deadly talons. The remaining girls shrieked in absolute terror while onlookers questioned how a monster bypassed the defensive barriers. Witnessing the horrific scene, Madame Fisher screamed her daughter's name in pure, agonizing panic. Stepping forward, Wolfgang was immediately halted by a guard warning that errant magic could easily strike the captive girl. Gritting his teeth, Wolfgang knew that hesitating would allow the beast to carry Emma to her inevitable death. Exuding absolute authority, he confidently ordered the panicked crowd to leave the rescue entirely to him. Analyzing the aerial threat, he calculated that simply dropping the girl from that height would result in severe injuries. Barking strict, tactical orders, he commanded a black-haired guard knight to position himself directly beneath the airborne monster. The knight instantly snapped to attention, roaring his compliance as he prepared to catch the falling child. Confident in his unique abilities, Wolfgang prepared his mystic eyes to cleanly burn the beast without singeing a single hair on Emma. Reaching for his specialized glasses with a lethal glare, he locked his destructive gaze onto the monstrous target above. The massive flying monster soared into the sky, clutching a screaming Emma tightly as she cried for help. Locking onto the beast, Wolfgang struck a dramatic pose and ruthlessly commanded the monster to burn. A sudden, intense pillar of flame erupted around the creature in midair, eliciting a horrific screech of agony. As the incinerated monster released its grip, Emma plummeted screaming until the black-haired guard caught her. Safely back on the ground, a terrified Emma sprinted desperately into her weeping mother's fierce embrace. Relieved that the young girl had escaped serious injury, Wolfgang quickly scanned the chaotic scene for his own daughter. Panic setting in, the frantic father sprinted through the garden while screaming Lulu's name at the top of his lungs. His heart pounded with dread as he feared a monster had snatched his precious child before the aerial attack began. Terrified of losing the only family he had left, Wolfgang continued his desperate search through the sprawling estate grounds. Suddenly, a tiny figure sprinted out from the bushes and collided hard against his legs. Gasping in absolute shock, Wolfgang looked down to find his beloved daughter clutching tightly to his trousers. Dropping instantly to his knees, he crushed the unharmed girl into a desperate hug while asking about her safety. Believing she was terrified, the relieved father gently promised her that the monster was defeated and she was safe. Instead of crying, the little girl looked up with sparkling eyes and excitedly praised her father for looking cool. Bouncing with joy, she cheered that he had flawlessly executed the dramatic magical pose practiced with her uncle. Staring at her starry-eyed admiration, Wolfgang realized his ridiculous theatrical performance had completely won over his daughter. Melting into a warm smile, he promised to always be a father she could be immensely proud of. Basking in the sweet moment, the protective duke stood tall with a renewed sense of unshakable parental purpose. His smile faded into a grim scowl as he questioned how a mountain-dwelling monster infiltrated the estate. Noting the capital's strong barriers should prevent such attacks, Wolfgang turned as a breathless Lord Fisher sprinted toward him. Panting heavily from exhaustion, the terrified head of the Fisher household bowed deeply to thank Wolfgang for saving his child. Gasping for air, Lord Fisher revealed that a second beast had simultaneously ambushed his eldest daughter near the stables. Stunned by the coordinated attack, Wolfgang realized the frantic nobleman had just been fighting a separate beast alone. Lord Fisher admitted he heard reports of the flying monster terrorizing the garden while trapped in combat. Trusting his daughter's life to Lord Zonta, Fisher explained he focused entirely on saving his eldest child. Gently forcing the grateful man to rise, Wolfgang deflected the praise and emphasized that both daughters were alive. Wiping tears away, Lord Fisher confirmed the physician expected both girls to heal without a single scar. Hearing this, Wolfgang remembered that the in-game Emma was a scarred supporting character with a tragic backstory. He recalled the game lore where Emma confessed a devastating fall during a monster attack permanently scarred her face. The original storyline involved Emma's sister losing a leg because the game's negligent Wolfgang skipped this crucial tea party. Wolfgang realized his unprecedented presence and swift coordination with Lord Fisher had rewritten a horrific tragedy into a minor incident. Struck by a profound epiphany, the reincarnated father understood this game's rigid timeline could be reshaped by his choices. Snapped out of his thoughts, Wolfgang watched his daughter sprint cheerfully across the lawn toward her recovered friend. Tears still drying on her cheeks, a bandaged Emma greeted Lulu warmly and checked to make sure she was unharmed. Puffing out her small chest bravely, the resilient young girl proudly declared her minor scratches were absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, the black-haired guard knight approached the brooding duke to deliver a solemn, belated apology. Bowing deeply, the knight thanked Wolfgang for stopping his attack, admitting his errant magic would have killed the hostage. Waving off the apology, Wolfgang confessed he would have made the exact same panicked mistake if his daughter was snatched. Acknowledging the grave political implications of a breached barrier, he insisted they focus purely on the children's miraculous survival. Turning his fond gaze back toward the giggling young girls playing safely, a quiet confidence settled deep into his chest. Armed with proof he could alter destiny, Wolfgang smiled brightly at the newfound hope for saving his precious daughter. Lord and Lady Fisher arrived to express their profound, boundless gratitude once more to Wolfgang for saving their daughters. Wolfgang frantically waved his hands, urging them not to be so formal since he had already accepted their thanks the other day. Pleading with the kneeling nobles to raise their heads, Wolfgang insisted he only did what any representative of the Duke was supposed to do. Reassuring them that she was completely fine, Louise gently asked how Emma and Lena were recovering from the traumatic attack. Lord Fisher laughed heartily, recalling how he had to forcibly stop his incredibly energetic daughters from trying to tag along on this visit to Lulu's house. He noted that Lena had made a full recovery and praised her for remaining calm and using magic to fight back when the monster first attacked. Realizing he was sounding like a typical doting father, Lord Fisher sheepishly apologized for gushing over his strong-willed kid. Wolfgang laughed warmly in response, playfully declaring that he absolutely refused to lose if they were having a contest over who loved their children more. Recalling a past meeting, Wolfgang casually mentioned how skilled Lena was with her magic, noting that Lulu had met her before alongside Katie. He chuckled affectionately as he remembered how an envious Lulu, having no siblings, had begged for a big sister of her own. Lady Fisher eagerly extended an invitation for them to visit once things settled down, adding that they absolutely had to bring Lord Zonta along. Sweating nervously, Wolfgang internally groaned as Lady Fisher enthusiastically gossiped about how all the ladies were dying to have tea with the dashing monster slayer. Ignoring her father's embarrassment, Louise excitedly agreed with the noblewomen, loudly declaring that her father really was incredibly cool. Desperate to change the subject, Wolfgang coughed loudly and asked Lord Fisher if they had discovered why the monster had appeared in the first place. Wolfgang's expression grew serious as he stared intensely at Lord Fisher, waiting for an explanation. The narrator explained that the monster attack on the Fisher estate had shocked the nation because it breached the powerful barrier protecting the capital's suburbs. Lord Fisher solemnly revealed that their immediate investigation discovered one of the estate's barrier stones had been broken. He corrected himself with a dark tone, clarifying that it would actually be more accurate to say the stone had been intentionally destroyed. Wolfgang gasped in shock, utterly stunned by the implication that the attack was a deliberate act of sabotage. The narrator explained that nobles infuse these vital barrier stones with magical power to repel monsters, making them the absolute lifeline of the kingdom. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Wolfgang connected the dots, understanding why the royal palace had suddenly ordered emergency inspections of all barrier stones. He concluded that the emergency summons for the Nobles' Council tomorrow had to be directly related to this horrifying assassination attempt. Lady Fisher sharply interrupted the grim conversation, scolding the two men for getting too absorbed in their dark theories. She firmly reminded them that discussing it now wouldn't solve anything since the official meeting wasn't until tomorrow. Gesturing toward a trembling Louise, Lady Fisher pointed out that their intense conversation was visibly worrying the young girl. Lord Fisher quickly apologized for his thoughtlessness, reassuring a frightened Louise that she had absolutely no reason to be concerned. Gently patting her head, Wolfgang smiled softly and promised his daughter that there was no need to worry as long as he was there. The following morning, a towering castle loomed over the city as preparations for the Nobles' Council began. Helping Wolfgang dress, Christoph complimented the Duke, noting that formal wear suited him even better than his usual light armor. Fixing his collar, Wolfgang grumbled in annoyance, once again demanding that Christoph stop calling him young master. Rolling his shoulders uncomfortably, Wolfgang complained that the stiff formal wear always made his muscles tense up. Hearing a quiet knock at the door, Wolfgang turned and warmly invited an early-rising Lulu into his room. Pushing the door open, Louise cheerfully greeted her father with a bright, sunny good morning. Seeing his sharp outfit, she gasped in surprise, prompting a concerned Wolfgang to quickly ask if something was wrong. Assuming she didn't like the clothes, Wolfgang awkwardly explained that he had to dress up for his trip to the castle. Shaking her head frantically, a blushing Louise clarified that she was just totally surprised by how incredibly cool he looked. Clenching his chest, Wolfgang internally screamed over how impossibly cute his precious daughter was, calling her an absolute angel. Smiling sweetly, Louise encouraged her father to do his very best at work so that Emma and Lena could finally feel safe again. Moved by his daughter's profound kindness, Wolfgang's expression hardened with serious, unyielding resolve. Giving her a confident nod, Wolfgang promised he would handle everything as he strode purposefully out the door to face the council. The nobility fiercely protects the kingdom from monsters using their superior magical power. Saints and saintesses travel yearly to replenish the massive barrier stones. These powerful nobles and saints remain absolutely indispensable for the kingdom's survival. Major crises instantly trigger a formal council gathering of all noble family heads. Wolfgang confidently arrives at the Grand Castle as acting Duke Lehmann. An irritatingly familiar voice suddenly calls out his official title. Turning around, Wolfgang dryly greets Lord Bernard after a long absence. The sarcastic nobleman mocks Wolfgang's notoriously rare attendance at social evening parties. Recognizing Peter Bernard, Wolfgang coldly replies that he simply despises socializing. Peter mockingly laments losing touch once Wolfgang's talented younger brother inherits the title. Secretly dubbing him Pebernard, Wolfgang questions why Peter isn't thrilled by his impending departure. Feigning deep hurt, Peter dramatically insists he will genuinely miss the acting duke. A ceremonial trumpet blasts, prompting Wolfgang to order Peter to his seat. Grumbling about the loud interruption, Peter tells Wolfgang to stop treating him like an animal. Flashing a smug smirk, Peter promises to corner Wolfgang right after the meeting concludes. Taking his seat, Wolfgang silently vows to bolt home immediately to escape the annoying lord. Massive double doors swing open to announce His Majesty the King's grand entrance. A heavy silence instantly suffocates the vast chamber as the regal figure approaches. The monarch ascends the carpeted stairs with a terrifyingly steady presence. His deliberate footsteps echo sharply across the hushed assembly of powerful lords. Reaching the summit, the imposing king turns to face his gathered subjects. Taking his royal throne, he commands the kneeling nobles to raise their heads. The entire council shifts in unison, lifting their gazes to await the royal decree. Apologizing for the abrupt summons, the king addresses the vicious monster attack on the Fisher estate. He reveals the chilling discovery that the Fisher family's barrier stone was intentionally destroyed. Consequently, he urgently ordered every noble house to inspect their own protective barrier stones. Shock ripples through the room as he confirms several other estates suffered identical sabotage. Deepening the horrific mystery, he states the protective area locks at all targeted houses functioned perfectly. Panicked murmurs erupt among the nobles as they process this terrifyingly impossible revelation. Realizing the gravity, Wolfgang notes an area lock absolutely nullifies all magical and physical attacks. The frantic council questions how any culprit could bypass the mandatory, unbreakable area locks. Deactivation methods vary wildly, ranging from complex wind magic seals to perfectly sung national anthems. Furthermore, any failed deactivation attempt instantly alerts the lock's creator, making these breaches inexplicably baffling. While a single leak is plausible, disabling multiple unique security measures simultaneously defies all logic. Finding zero pattern among the targeted houses, the king desperately urges anyone to report suspicious activity. Sweeping his intense gaze across the tense council, he demands answers. Stepping forward, Baron Hoffmann humbly begs the king for permission to speak. Granted the floor, the Baron reveals a concerning connection discovered while speaking with other victims. During a routine area lock replacement, a delivery merchant muttered something incredibly strange. The ominous merchant had specifically wished that something very good might happen to them. Baron Hoffmann reveals all targeted households heard the exact same phrase from entirely different merchants. Commanding silence, the king orders anyone who recognizes the merchant's phrase to remain in the hall. Dismissing the rest, the monarch instructs departing nobles to thoroughly interrogate their households just in case. As the dismissed nobles exit, a sudden voice calls out for Lord Zonta. Wolfgang greets Lord Fisher, who nervously corrects the title to acting Lord Learman in this setting. Lord Fisher admits his merchant used the bizarre phrase, but he carelessly dismissed it as a greeting. Suddenly, another sharp voice echoes across the room to directly address the acting Duke. Peter Bernard approaches and bluntly announces that the mysterious merchant delivered the same message to his family. Overhearing nearby nobles panicking about their unguarded estates, Wolfgang feels a growing sense of urgent dread. Checking quietly with his peers, Wolfgang discovers that several households entirely avoided the strange merchant interaction. The random nature of these targeted attacks leaves the gathered nobles bewildered about the mastermind's identity. Complaining about his ruined chat, Peter abruptly decides to leave and gather intelligence. Laughing loudly, the eccentric Duke sprints away and promises to meet Wolfgang at the next party. Watching him dart down the hall, Lord Fisher sighs heavily over Lord Bernard's chaotic behavior. Noting Wolfgang's visible annoyance, Lord Fisher prompts the acting Duke to wonder if his irritation is obvious. Wolfgang theorizes his old academy classmate deliberately pesters him because he hates his regent status. Smiling knowingly, Lord Fisher gently hints that Peter's hostile behavior might actually mask genuine fondness. Wolfgang mentally celebrates his impending retirement from high society, relieved to soon avoid Peter entirely. Later at the Learman estate, a loud voice violently snaps Wolfgang out of his deep thoughts. Christoph calmly offers a tea refill to their surprise guest, who accepts with a haughty smile. Staring across his own living room, Wolfgang sits frozen in absolute, terrified disbelief. He silently screams, completely unable to process why Duke Peter Bernard is lounging in his house. Ignoring the shock, Peter reveals a Kregel Academy teacher heard the same phrase during an area lock delivery. Processing the terrifying scope, Wolfgang realizes numerous destroyed barrier stones likely remain unnoticed across the country. A grim silence falls as they acknowledge a monster attack on unshielded territories would mean absolute massacre. Peter groans over the lack of common links among victims, noting they span different regions and merchants. Struck by sudden tactical brilliance, Wolfgang gasps and mutters a revelation about shipping companies. He details how regional merchants buy standardized area locks directly from the centralized Magic Tool Guild. Following this logic, Wolfgang points out a massive shared logistics network must physically transport these vital goods. Catching the genius deduction, Peter realizes saboteurs are likely infiltrating a shared shipping company instead of merchants. Peter eagerly agrees to investigate the academy while Wolfgang plans inquiry letters to Fisher and Peter. Watching Peter happily praise Christoph's tea, Wolfgang instantly regrets looping the eccentric Duke into this private investigation. A painful flashback reveals Wolfgang desperately trying to convince Peter to simply communicate via letters. Despite Wolfgang's frantic attempts to decline, Peter ruthlessly shot down every excuse and demanded to visit. Snapping back to reality, Wolfgang sighs deeply and regrets surrendering to Peter's exhausting demands. Noting Wolfgang's massive sigh, Peter playfully warned the acting Duke that his happiness would escape if he wasn't careful. Feigning deep offense, Peter loudly complained about coming all the way to the estate just to answer his questions. Wolfgang furiously retorted that he had repeatedly told him not to come, accusing the arrogant lord of dodging the issue. Completely ignoring Peter's desire for a trivial information war, Wolfgang demanded he state his business and leave immediately. Peter simply smirked and reminded his exasperated host that even an acting Duke should display proper hospitality. Suddenly, a gentle voice called from the doorway as someone timidly asked to interrupt for just a moment. Christoph immediately apologized for intruding while a nervous Louise peeked shyly into the tension-filled room. Fidgeting nervously, the young girl confessed that she merely wanted to properly greet her father's unexpected guest. Mentally groaning over the annoyance of introducing his daughter to such an eccentric man, Wolfgang reluctantly yielded to her request. Pasting on a polite smile, Wolfgang formally announced to Lord Bernard that his daughter wished to greet him. Stepping forward with elegant grace, Louise flawlessly introduced herself and expressed her profound pleasure at meeting the visiting Duke. Wolfgang internally wept with pride over her perfect curtsy, fiercely regretting that such sheer elegance was wasted on Peter. Returning the greeting with unexpected charm, Peter thanked Lady Louise for her courtesy and formally introduced himself. Flashing a bright smile, the eccentric nobleman boldly declared himself to be her father's cherished childhood friend. Gasping in sheer delight, Louise eagerly asked if that meant he had known her father since his academy days. Peter proudly puffed out his chest and confidently proclaimed himself to be Wolfgang's absolute best and only friend. Staring in complete shock, a bewildered Wolfgang desperately wondered when exactly they had ever become best friends. Kneeling to her level, Peter warmly invited the little lady to join them for tea and hear stories about her parents. Beaming with absolute joy, the eager young girl instantly agreed to the delightful invitation. Settling in around the table, the trio quickly became engrossed in a surprisingly lively and nostalgic tea party. Fast-forwarding through the hours, the narrator confirmed that Peter ended up staying at the estate until evening. The extended visit was entirely due to Lulu's insatiable desire to hear every possible story about her parents' academy days. Peter happily answered every single question she threw at him until he finally noticed how late it had gotten. Expressing genuine sadness, the visiting duke politely announced that it was finally time for him to take his leave. Refusing to let the stories end, an excited Louise begged him to return and tell her more tales in the future. Waving cheerfully from the doorway, she loudly thanked the departing nobleman and bid him a fond farewell. Watching his daughter wave, Wolfgang quietly admitted to Peter that he was completely surprised by the afternoon's events. Wolfgang noted his astonishment at how many intricate details Peter remembered about him and Katie from their school days. Frowning in confusion, Wolfgang bluntly stated that he didn't actually recall the two of them spending much time together back then. Pausing in the doorway, Peter cryptically replied that Wolfgang wouldn't have noticed him even if he was in those memories. Fixing Wolfgang with an intense, unreadable stare, Peter coldly addressed him by his formal title. Delivering a chilling final blow, Peter noted that while Wolfgang easily remembered his name, he had completely forgotten his face. Locking eyes with the acting duke, Peter coldly noted that while Wolfgang remembered names, he completely failed to recognize faces. Refusing to break eye contact, the arrogant nobleman challenged Wolfgang to deny the chilling accusation. Acknowledging Peter's undeniable authority as a duke, a cornered Wolfgang let out a defeated sigh. Dropping his guard, Wolfgang quietly asked the eccentric nobleman how he had managed to figure out his deepest secret. Smirking in triumph, Peter revealed he had harbored suspicions about Wolfgang's strange behavior ever since their academy days. He pointed out that despite being frequently absent for his saint duties, Wolfgang made absolutely zero effort to interact with anyone when he was around. Pacing around the room, Peter observed that Wolfgang would politely answer if spoken to but never once initiated a conversation himself. The observant duke noted how Wolfgang's entire demeanor would suddenly shift the moment someone like Peter formally introduced themselves mid-conversation. Connecting the clues, Peter confidently concluded that Wolfgang was physically incapable of recognizing him until he explicitly gave his name. Cursing Peter's terrifyingly sharp memory, Wolfgang mentally admitted he was terrible at hiding his affliction during his Kregel Academy days. Surrendering to the truth, the acting duke finally confessed his complete inability to recognize people's faces. He explained that while he could read expressions, a person's entire face would always blur into an unrecognizable mess in his mind. Acknowledging the heavy burden of his flaw, Wolfgang admitted this facial blindness was a major reason his parents denied him the ducal title. The tragic reality was that he couldn't even recognize the faces of his own beloved family members. He revealed that the royal head magician eventually diagnosed his terrifying flame demon eye as the root cause of his visual impairment. Because his cursed eye automatically incinerated anything he consciously recognized, his brain had developed a desperate defense mechanism. He subconsciously refused to recognize faces specifically to prevent himself from accidentally burning the people around him alive. Softening his harsh tone, Peter gently pointed out that Lady Cassandra's tireless efforts had miraculously changed Wolfgang's isolated world. The Duke reminisced that despite being official fiancés at the start of their enrollment, the two had acted like complete strangers. He praised the admirable girl for relentlessly approaching the distant Wolfgang even when he continuously shut her out. Peter dramatically cheered as he recalled the historic moment Wolfgang finally called out Cassandra's name, breaking his lifelong silence. Wiping away comical tears of joy, Peter admitted the memory still moved him while Wolfgang internally groaned over how closely the man had stalked them. Regaining his composure, Peter admitted his absolute bewilderment over how Wolfgang mysteriously learned to recognize only Cassandra's face. Suddenly leaning in with intense focus, Peter firmly demanded that Wolfgang finally remember his face as well. Utterly baffled by the bizarre request, Wolfgang cautiously asked what the eccentric duke was really trying to say. Bursting into loud laughter at Wolfgang's confused expression, Peter playfully chided him for being cruel despite his immense love for him as a friend. Staring back with pure skepticism, Wolfgang loudly questioned how they could possibly be friends if he didn't even remember his face. Dropping his playful facade, Peter solemnly confessed that he considered them friends because Wolfgang had once saved his life. Genuinely shocked by the revelation, a completely clueless Wolfgang desperately racked his brain to remember ever saving the eccentric nobleman. Abruptly ignoring the confusion he just caused, Peter noticed the dark sky and cheerfully announced it was time for his departure. Bowing politely, the departing Duke asked Wolfgang to give his warmest regards to the young lady Louise. Pausing dramatically at the door, Peter suddenly snapped his fingers and mentioned he had almost forgotten the most important detail. He swiftly delivered his intelligence report, confirming his family's area lock merchant utilized a shipping company called Giskahite. He further revealed that a highly suspicious, unrelated duo consisting of a grim-faced man and a black-haired boy had been temporarily hired for that specific delivery. Sprinting away with booming laughter, Peter left a furious Wolfgang screaming that he should have shared that vital information immediately. Waving wildly from the departing carriage, the chaotic Duke yelled a final, thunderous farewell to the exasperated acting Duke. Slamming the massive estate doors shut, Wolfgang angrily muttered that the annoying nobleman was definitely enjoying his little games. Exhausted by the overwhelming encounter, the wary father slowly trudged down the quiet, dimly lit corridors of his empty manor. Pushing open the heavy wooden doors, he stepped into the sacred, silent gallery filled with his countless portraits of Cassandra. Gazing lovingly at her painted smile, Wolfgang sighed and confessed to Katie that Peter's relentless stories had flooded his mind with precious memories of her. Gazing at Katie's portrait, Wolfgang felt immensely guilty for previously avoiding her out of fear. Confirming Peter's observations, Wolfgang recalled being utterly unable to recognize his fiancée's face. The devoted Katie refused to quit, grabbing his hand to solve it together. Working together, the couple concluded that drawing portraits was the ultimate solution. He endlessly sketched her portraits just to keep her beautiful form nearby. Through constant repetition, his clouded vision of her face slowly began to clear. He recalled the overwhelming joy of finally recognizing her in a crowded classroom. Returning to reality, Wolfgang promised Katie he would keep drawing for Lulu. Shifting focus, he knew Peter's intelligence held the key to stopping the monsters. The report mentioned a highly suspicious grim-faced man and a black-haired boy. Wolfgang immediately concluded that the shady shipping company was driving the sabotage. He suddenly suspected the black-haired boy was Carl, a major game capture target. He recalled that the original Otome game featured 5 highly desirable romantic interests. Unlike the nobleman, Carl was a dark slum orphan tied to the Assassin's Guild. The rare black-haired boy perfectly matched the 11-year-old Carl's timeline. Wolfgang noted the infamous Assassin's Guild frequently accepted highly illegal, lucrative jobs. Carl's guild ties easily explained his presence in this massive national conspiracy. Preparing to leave, Wolfgang kneeled down to address a nervous Lulu. Staring intensely, he strictly commanded her to stay glued to his side. He warned her to remain perfectly quiet regardless of any terrifying surprises. Taking action, Wolfgang planned to visit the orphanage where players first meet Carl. Using a generous donation as cover, he easily secured an official visit. Despite his facial blindness, past life memories allowed him to easily identify game characters. He confidently reasoned he could recognize Carl's distinct features just like Lulu's. Wolfgang remembered Carl possessed a terrifyingly ruthless, bloodthirsty assassin persona during combat. The Duke resolved to adopt the boy before he became an irredeemable criminal. He selfishly hoped saving the young assassin would earn Lulu a deadly protector. Bracing himself, the protective father swore to completely rewrite the game's tragic scenario. Their grand carriage soon arrived in the royal capital's dangerous Heine district. Glancing outside, Wolfgang frowned deeply at the rundown, impoverished slum streets. He mentally cursed the government's total failure to fix the crime-ridden district. Gripped by parental fear, he deeply regretted bringing his daughter to this wasteland. A sudden flashback revealed Lulu tearfully begging to join his dangerous mission. The brave girl passionately argued she needed to learn about the real world. Bursting with immense pride, Wolfgang had been utterly unable to refuse her request. Stepping outside, they stood before the dilapidated orphanage of the mountain god. The incredibly grateful headmistress rushed out to heavily thank Lord Zonta. Wolfgang stared in genuine surprise at the woman's extremely rare draconic horns. He quickly confirmed his monetary donation and asked where to unload their supplies. Bowing deeply, the exhausted headmistress tearfully apologized for their severe staff shortages. Wolfgang awkwardly presents several picture books donated by his daughter. Expressing deep gratitude, the headmistress promises to read them aloud to the children. She explains that the books are wonderful for their studies since most of the orphans cannot read. Stepping forward nervously, Louise asks if it is all right to distribute the homemade sweets she brought for everyone. Wolfgang notes that his daughter spent the entire previous day cooking in the kitchen to prepare the perfect treat. Delighted by the generous gesture, the headmistress assures them that the children will be absolutely thrilled. She hesitates slightly, warning Wolfgang that meeting the destitute orphans directly might deeply shock the young noblewoman. Brushing off the concern, Wolfgang insists that Louise understands the harsh reality of the orphanage and genuinely wants to help. Seeking confirmation, he looks down at his daughter as she nods with fierce determination. Acknowledging their firm resolve, the headmistress gracefully bows in understanding. Gesturing toward the gloomy hallway, she respectfully leads the noble guests deeper into the facility. Stepping into the main room, the pair encounters a large group of ragged orphans staring curiously at them. Scanning the room, Wolfgang observes that the impoverished group consists primarily of human and beastmen children. He internally laments the miserable environment, noting the crumbling walls and barely adequate living conditions. Clapping her hands, the headmistress gathers the orphans and announces the massive donation provided by Lord Zonta and Lady Louise. Prompted by their caretaker, the ragged children bow their heads and shout a synchronized thank you to their benefactors. Stepping up bravely, a nervous Louise holds out her basket and announces she brought homemade sweets for everyone. Hearing the word sweets, the starving orphans instantly perk up with wide, hungry eyes. Chaos abruptly erupts as the desperate children violently shove each other to reach the basket first. Swarmed by the aggressive crowd, a terrified Louise freezes in absolute shock. Watching the situation spiral out of control, Wolfgang mentally curses and prepares to intervene. Recovering her courage, Louise loudly promises the frantic mob that there is plenty of food for everyone if they stop rushing. Stunned by the young noblewoman's sudden authority, the aggressive orphans immediately halt their shoving. Seizing the moment, the headmistress steps in to reinforce the young lady's command for order. Pointing firmly, she orders the kids to form a single, organized line to receive their treats. Relieved that a riot was avoided, Wolfgang notes that sugar remains an extreme luxury that these orphans have likely never tasted. He swells with immense pride, deeply impressed by how calmly his daughter handled a situation completely alien to her sheltered noble upbringing. Watching her hand out sweets with a gentle smile, Wolfgang realizes with a hint of sadness that his little girl is growing up fast. Snapping back to his true mission, Wolfgang remembers he urgently needs to locate Karl among the orphans. He discreetly scans the bustling room as the happy children eagerly devour their rare sugary snacks. Continuing his search, the Duke carefully evaluates every face in the crowd. Frustrated that he cannot spot anyone matching Karl's description, Wolfgang absent-mindedly accepts another round of thanks from the headmistress. The headmistress emotionally confesses that the sweets have brought rare, genuine life back to children who normally succumb to apathy. Deeply moved by her tragic explanation, Wolfgang asks if there is absolutely anything else he can do to help the facility. Waving her hands humbly, she insists that their immense generosity has already been more than enough. As Wolfgang internally calculates the political backlash of showering the orphanage with gold while ignoring the slums, a cheerful shout breaks his concentration. Whirling around, he sees an ecstatic Louise excitedly calling him over to look at something. Bouncing with sheer joy, the young girl loudly praises an older boy's incredible magical abilities. Confused, Wolfgang approaches and peers down at a tiny, bean-sized object resting in the palm of a child's hand. Squinting closely at the minuscule object, the Duke is stunned to realize it is actually a perfectly formed, microscopic rose. As Wolfgang questions the existence of such a tiny flower, Louise gleefully reveals it used to be a completely normal size. Shrinking back shyly, the boy mumbles that he only shrunk the flower as a humble thank you for the delicious sweets. He explains that he plucked the original, full-sized rose straight from the orphanage courtyard. Embarrassed, the boy admits he accidentally overdid the shrinking magic while attempting to create a simple pressed flower. The headmistress approaches and clarifies that while the child cannot cast general spells, he possesses the unique ability to shrink objects. Completely ignoring the headmistress, a wide-eyed Wolfgang stares intensely at the boy and demands to know his name. Flinching under the intense gaze, the dark-haired boy quietly reveals that his name is Karl. Staring at the boy's rare black hair and black eyes, Wolfgang mentally celebrates finding his exact target. However, the Duke is utterly baffled, as the original game never once mentioned Karl possessing such bizarre shrinking magic. A sudden, brilliant realization strikes Wolfgang as he rapidly calculates the tactical applications of shrinking magic. Grabbing the startled boy by the shoulders, a fiery determination erupts in the Duke's eyes. Announcing his full name with booming authority, Wolfgang dramatically introduces himself to the young orphan. Shouting with absolute conviction, he loudly declares his ambitious plan to launch a massive business venture that will revolutionize the entire slums. Grabbing the young orphan's attention, Wolfgang loudly declared his ambitious plan to launch a business involving the entire area. Staring back in utter bewilderment, Karl let out a confused gasp. The young boy stood completely paralyzed, his mind struggling to process the nobleman's sudden outburst. The narrator triumphantly announced that this unexpected encounter would forge a new path for his beloved daughter's destiny. Stammering in absolute shock, the headmistress questioned Lord Zonta about his bizarre business proposal. Wolfgang calmly explained that he had been desperately searching for a way to shrink objects to fulfill a deeply personal wish. Gesturing toward the stunned boy, the Duke declared that Karl's unique magic was the absolute key to making that dream a reality. He openly admitted that it would be incredibly easy for House Zonta to simply adopt the boy for his powers. Hearing this, the panicked orphans crowded around Karl and frantically asked if he was leaving them to become a noble's child. Overwhelmed by his friend's desperate pleas, Karl stammered helplessly as he searched for an answer. Wolfgang silently recalled that the game's version of Karl joined the Assassin's Guild specifically to save this very orphanage from poverty. He remembered that the tragic slum orphan had limited options and inevitably resorted to illegal, high-risk assassinations to fund his companions. Trusting the boy's deep loyalty, Wolfgang confidently stated that Karl would never choose a path that abandoned his suffering friends. Offering a life-changing deal, the Duke promised to provide the capital if Karl used his magic to build a business that employed everyone in the slums. Wide-eyed with awe, Karl quietly asked if his magic could truly create jobs for his friends. Wolfgang confirmed the plan, noting that while the magic would launch the venture, he eventually wanted to develop other selling points. He announced his intention to investigate the hidden talents of everyone in the orphanage, instantly sparking a massive wave of excitement. The desperate children immediately swarmed the Duke, eagerly shouting out their meager skills in sewing and running. As the orphans clamored over their abilities in singing and drawing, Wolfgang frantically tried to calm the chaotic mob. Turning back to the overwhelmed headmistress, Wolfgang politely apologized for shocking her with his abrupt proposal. He firmly argued that teaching the slums to become self-reliant was far better than forcing them to survive on unstable donations. Recognizing her deep connection to the impoverished area, the Duke humbly requested to borrow the priestess's wisdom for his grand project. He promised to personally negotiate with the noble administering the Heine district so they could all build this business together. The priestess stood in profound silence, absorbing the massive scale and sincerity of his unprecedented benevolence. Closing her eyes in deep respect, the headmistress formally accepted Count Zonta's sweeping proposal. Moved by his genuine care for their survival, she pledged the absolute, unwavering cooperation of herself and the temple priests. Acknowledging that local nobles might violently oppose his new venture, she fiercely vowed to do her utmost to persuade them. Wolfgang smiled warmly and thanked the dedicated priestess for her vital, unshakable support. Whirling back toward a startled Karl, the Duke announced he wanted to borrow the boy and take him home for a while. Stepping closer, Wolfgang officially requested a job and declared himself to be Karl's very first customer. He confidently assured the stunned orphan that he would be paid properly for his magical services. Trembling in absolute disbelief, Karl whispered a hesitant question about actually receiving real compensation. Tears welling in his eyes, the young boy desperately asked if the Duke was truly serious about the offer. Wolfgang firmly promised to draft a proper contract verified by the priestess, insisting it was only natural to pay for such power. The headmistress solemnly invoked the name of the god Vunald, formally accepting the sacred contract on the boy's behalf. Reaching out his hand, Wolfgang gently asked Karl if he was ready to come with him. Wiping tears from his eyes, a fiercely determined Karl loudly agreed to follow the noble. The surrounding orphans erupted into joyous cheers, loudly celebrating Karl's incredible new job with the Count. Karl blushed furiously as his cheeky friends demanded he bring back fancy sweets as souvenirs from the estate. Watching the heartwarming scene unfold, a beaming Louise excitedly asked her father if Karl was coming to their house. Looking down at his beaming daughter, Wolfgang praised Lulu for doing a great job finding the talented orphan. Eagerly reacting to his praise, Lulu happily realized that Karl's cooperation would make her father's grand wish a reality. Wolfgang smiled warmly and affectionately credited all of their success to his daughter's sharp intuition. However, the Duke internally groaned, realizing his impulsive, unconsulted business decision would undoubtedly earn him a harsh scolding from Christoph. Pushing his worries aside, Wolfgang turned to Karl and enthusiastically announced that they would start the new project right away. A trembling Karl desperately bowed his head, struggling through tears to thank the Count for everything he was doing. Seeing the young boy's raw gratitude, Wolfgang internally resolved that the inevitable scolding was entirely worth it. Acknowledging that critics might call him a hypocrite, the resolute noble vowed to always do whatever he could within his reach. Later that day, Wolfgang proudly escorted his newest employee into the grand halls of the Lehrmann estate. Deep inside the manor, Christoph helped a severely anxious Karl change out of his ragged street clothes. Bursting into the room with uncontained excitement, Lulu demanded that her father look at how wonderful Karl appeared. The young orphan stepped out nervously, wearing a crisp, elegant noble's outfit. Blushing furiously, Karl nervously admitted that the finely tailored clothes felt a little drafty compared to his usual rags. Smiling proudly, Wolfgang praised the boy's clean appearance, noting it was lucky they had kept Marcus's old childhood clothes. Karl anxiously fidgeted with his collar, quietly asking if the outfit made him look strange or out of place. Denying it instantly, Lulu enthusiastically clapped her hands and reassured the nervous boy that he looked absolutely wonderful. Overwhelmed by her sweet compliment, Karl bowed his head slightly and shyly thanked the young noblewoman. Shifting to business, Wolfgang gently interrupted the wholesome moment, mentioning he had something important to ask the boy. Understanding the cue, Lulu politely excused herself and announced she would return to her room, bidding Karl a cheerful goodbye. Watching his daughter gracefully exit, Wolfgang mentally cried tears of joy, asking Katie to witness how wonderfully considerate their little girl had become. A confused Karl awkwardly called out to the emotional Duke, snapping him back to reality. Coughing to clear his throat, Wolfgang reminded himself that his primary goal was to interrogate Karl about the area lock incident and protect him from the fallout. Leaning forward seriously, the Duke asked Karl if he had recently helped an adult man with any transportation jobs. Karl immediately confirmed the suspicion, revealing that a man named Hermann had offered him money to help with a job using his magic. The young boy explained that he acted as a lookout, carried luggage, and used his shrinking magic on various objects exactly as Hermann instructed. Gripping his pants nervously, Karl confessed that Hermann, initially nice, eventually grew violent and began threatening him. Karl sadly revealed that the cruel man forced him to overexert his magic but completely refused to pay him in the end. Hearing the tragic backstory, Wolfgang immediately understood why the poor orphan had been so incredibly wary when he had offered to pay him earlier. Apologizing for bringing up painful memories, Wolfgang asked the boy to describe or draw exactly what Hermann had forced him to shrink. Karl described an object originally the size of his palm, embedded with a pretty stone, which he shrank down to the size of his pinky finger. Staring intensely at the rough sketch Karl provided, Wolfgang instantly recognized the complex device. He identified it as a state-of-the-art communication magic tool recently developed by the Mage's Tower International Research Institute. Wolfgang explained that these advanced tools functioned as a pair, allowing one device to transmit its sights and sounds directly to the other. A horrifying realization dawned on the Duke as he understood the full capabilities of modern magical technology. He deduced that the saboteurs had secretly attached these shrunken transmitters directly to the area locks. By hiding the microscopic devices, the culprits simply used the paired receivers to safely watch the nobles input their highly classified deactivation methods. The genius plot exploited a massive blind spot, relying entirely on the fact that shrinking magic was virtually unheard of in the kingdom. Realizing his accidental involvement in a massive crime, a terrified Karl frantically called out to the Duke. Gently patting the trembling boy's head, Wolfgang quickly reassured him that he wasn't at fault because he had been completely used without knowing the truth. Sparing the boy further anxiety, the Duke gently promised to handle the situation, instructing Karl to simply answer any future questions with absolute honesty. Karl's crucial testimony caused the investigation into the area lock sabotage to take a sudden and dramatic turn. Sweating nervously, Karl confirmed his terrifying encounters to the royal investigators. The investigation quickly revealed that the 7 merchants involved all utilized the Giskahite shipping company, explaining how the transmitters were attached. Wolfgang mentally noted that the culprits had skimmed the deactivation codes, explaining why the locks themselves were unharmed. As a temporary countermeasure, an emergency order was issued instructing nobles to set hyperspecific deactivation conditions to prevent strangers from bypassing them. A traumatized Karl silently reflected on how Hermann had initially seemed like a kind and trustworthy person. Merchant testimonies revealed Hermann utilized a charm magic tool, easily brainwashing the merchants and Karl into following his orders. Heavily armed First-Order knights aggressively kicked down the door of the criminal's known hideout. However, the knights only found Hermann's murdered corpse, proving he was assassinated before he could be captured. Wolfgang frowned grimly, realizing that the true mastermind had ruthlessly cut off the lizard's tail to protect their identity. Snapping back to the present, Wolfgang gently called out to his daughter, asking if she needed him. A frantic Lulu burst through the door, apologizing loudly for interrupting her father's work. Christoph, carrying a small box, bowed respectfully and apologized for keeping the young lady waiting. Beaming with immense pride, Christoph gently handed the small box to the young noblewoman. Smiling warmly, Wolfgang urged a trembling Lulu to go ahead and open her mysterious gift. With trembling hands, the young girl carefully lifted the lid off the ornate box. Gasping in absolute delight, Lulu pulled out a gorgeous, delicately crafted locket pendant. Opening the locket, she stared in awe at a perfectly shrunk, miniature drawing of her family. Tears filled her eyes as she recognized the tiny, intricate portraits of her father and herself alongside her mother. Wolfgang gently reminded her that she had originally requested a portrait featuring both her father and mother standing together. He explained that he created a new drawing featuring her current 6-year-old self, believing Katie would want to see how much she had grown. Clutching the locket to her chest, a weeping Lulu thanked her father from the absolute bottom of her heart. Wolfgang proudly revealed that Carl used his unique shrinking magic to perfectly fit the portrait inside the pendant. Whirling around, a beaming Lulu loudly thanked the young orphan for his incredible help. Carl blushed furiously and stammered, completely overwhelmed by her profound, tearful gratitude. Gripping his hands tightly, a blushing Carl quietly admitted how happy he felt to finally be useful. Bouncing with excitement, Lulu eagerly asked her father for permission to show off her new treasure to all the maids. Chuckling at her boundless energy, Wolfgang happily encouraged her to go show it off as much as she wanted. Flashing a blindingly bright smile, Lulu cheered loudly before sprinting toward the door. Laughing as Carl stared in shock at her speed, Wolfgang celebrated receiving his daughter's best smile as she slammed the door behind her. Clearing his throat to reset the mood, Wolfgang praised Carl's hard work and asked how his studies were progressing. Fidgeting nervously, Carl admitted that his magic tutor was struggling because it was their first time teaching a student with mixed attributes. Wolfgang noted that Carl's miniaturization magic became dangerously unstable whenever he attempted to shrink objects with highly complex structures. Carl confessed that he had failed repeatedly and was harshly yelled at when forced to shrink Hermann's intricate communication tool. Acknowledging the flaw, Wolfgang explained that Carl needed formal training with Lulu's tutor to stabilize his magic for their impending business. The tutor confirmed that Carl's unique miniaturization ability was only possible because he possessed the exceedingly rare combination of water and earth attributes. Wolfgang sighed, recognizing that finding a specialized tutor for such a rare attribute combination would be incredibly difficult. Panicking over causing trouble, Carl frantically apologized, but Wolfgang immediately stopped him with a reassuring smile. The Duke warmly reminded Carl that his magic was the only reason the beautiful locket was even possible. Reminding the boy of Lulu's massive smile, Wolfgang sincerely thanked him for bringing his daughter so much joy. Acknowledging the praise, Carl smiled softly and agreed that he was truly glad to make the young lady happy. Watching the boy's genuine expression, Wolfgang silently celebrated the breakthrough. He noted with immense satisfaction that Carl's emotional growth was trending perfectly in the right direction. Ultimately, Wolfgang recognized that securing Carl's loyalty and saving the slums was purely a tactical move to protect Lulu's future. Vowing to find a better tutor for the boy, Wolfgang considered solving the slum's massive poverty problem to be an excellent bonus. Dismissing the boy with a gentle pat on the head, Wolfgang told Carl to go play with Lulu. Christoph praised the young orphan's incredible dedication, noting his strong, undeniable desire to save the children of the slums. Shifting gears, Wolfgang asked his loyal butler for an update regarding their ongoing investigation into the slums workforce. Christoph confidently reported that his teams were discovering quite a few excellent candidates hiding within the impoverished district. He detailed their plan to assign specific jobs based on individual talents, ensuring even the unskilled workers received manageable tasks. While Christoph admitted the initial investment was staggering, he confidently projected they would completely recoup the costs within a few years. Sweating nervously over his rapidly draining bank accounts, Wolfgang nervously agreed that the massive initial costs were necessary. Despite Marcus begging to help fund the project, Wolfgang stubbornly refused to use the Lehmann House treasury. Refusing to burden his younger brother with his own reckless decisions, Wolfgang launched the massive venture solely under his Count Zonta title. However, he compromised by allowing House Lehmann to act as his official sponsor, pacifying his incredibly anxious younger brother. He noted that Baron Heine, the district administrator, eagerly supported the project to finally resolve the slum's historic poverty issues. Groaning over his tight budget, Wolfgang lamented that he would have to live frugally and temporarily stop buying Lulu expensive dresses. Christoph chuckled softly, pointing out that despite his constant complaints, the Duke looked like he was genuinely enjoying the challenge. Smiling confidently, Wolfgang admitted he was incredibly excited to see how Karl and the revitalized town would evolve. Smirking back, Wolfgang teased Christoph that the butler's obvious enjoyment would make it incredibly hard for him to ever retire. Suddenly remembering an important task, Christoph reached into his jacket. As the butler pulled out a sealed envelope, Wolfgang angrily demanded he stop calling him young master. Pausing mid-rant, Wolfgang stared closely at the highly unusual wax seal on the mysterious letter. A deep sense of dread washed over the Duke as he realized the seal belonged exclusively to the royal family. Christoph solemnly confirmed Wolfgang's worst fear, announcing that the letter was a direct, personal missive from His Majesty the King. Staring in absolute shock, Wolfgang desperately wondered why the king was personally contacting him. Wolfgang knelt respectfully before the king, expressing deep gratitude for the honor of this royal audience. Acknowledging his loyalty from the Grand Throne, the monarch warmly welcomed the acting Duke Lehmann. Sweating nervously, Wolfgang internally panicked as he desperately wondered how his situation had escalated to this terrifying point. While the king recounted the monster attack on the Fischer estate, Wolfgang silently wished he could just go home to be comforted by Lulu. The king highly praised Wolfgang for uncovering the devastating area lock tampering plot and preventing countless casualties. Bowing lower, Wolfgang humbly expressed his profound emotion at receiving such incredible praise directly from His Majesty. The monarch also commended Wolfgang's innovative water pump and his recent efforts to reform the slums alongside Baron Heine. Declaring his immense satisfaction, the king unexpectedly bestowed the highly prestigious title of Marquis upon the stunned duke. The king clarified that Wolfgang would officially become Marquis Zonta the moment the ducal succession was fully finalized. Panicking internally, Wolfgang desperately screamed in his mind that he absolutely did not want a rank promotion. He realized with sheer horror that a higher rank would elevate Lulu into a crown princess candidate, forcing her right back onto the villainous route. Sweating profusely, Wolfgang nervously interrupted the king, knowing he had to avoid this disastrous scenario at all costs. Stating it was a tremendous honor, Wolfgang carefully claimed the royal reward was far greater than he actually deserved. The surrounding nobles gasped in absolute shock, utterly bewildered that someone would dare refuse a direct reward from the king. Wolfgang internally reasoned that his severe facial blindness made high-ranking duties impossible, remembering his parents disinherited him for that exact reason. The king calmly accepted the refusal and asked the acting duke if there was something else he truly desired instead. Seizing the golden opportunity, Wolfgang requested an introduction to a specialized magic tutor capable of teaching mixed attributes. He explained that during his ongoing slum reform efforts, he encountered a young boy possessing this incredibly rare magical affinity. The duke expressed his strong desire to help the boy develop his fascinating magic but lacked the connections to find a proper teacher. He added that normal tutors could not handle the boy's complex power, forcing him to seek royal assistance. The king asked if that modest request was truly his only wish, to which Wolfgang confirmed it would vastly aid his slum reforms. Chuckling warmly, the monarch praised the acting duke for making such an incredibly selfless and modest request. The king officially put the Marquis promotion on hold, causing Wolfgang to heave a massive, internal sigh of relief. Promising to dispatch a suitable mixed attribute tutor as a reward, the king dismissed Wolfgang and called the next noble forward. Walking away with exhausted relief, Wolfgang groaned about the nerve-wracking ordeal and yearned to finally see his beloved daughter. Suddenly, a painfully familiar voice called out, loudly praising the acting duke for daring to refuse a royal promotion. Turning around, Wolfgang glared at Peter Bernard and sharply asked if the eccentric nobleman was being sarcastic. Peter casually argued that accepting the promotion would have been far better for securing Lady Louise's future. Glaring at his strangely perceptive rival, Wolfgang cursed Peter's sharp intuition and mentally demanded the man stop prying. Peter mischievously pointed out that Wolfgang's unprecedented refusal made the noble who received the next reward look incredibly uncomfortable. Shrugging off the guilt, Wolfgang firmly stated that the modest rank of count was perfectly suited to him. When Peter accused him of underestimating his own talent, Wolfgang insisted that even acting as a duke was completely overwhelming. Peter began to argue back but was suddenly interrupted by a commotion. A small figure violently crashed into Wolfgang's leg, causing the duke to stumble backward in sheer surprise. Looking down, Wolfgang spotted an arrogant-looking child rubbing his head after the sudden, painful collision. Staring in pure disbelief, Wolfgang immediately recognized the boy's face and realized his terrible luck had struck again. A frantic attendant rushed over, screaming at Wolfgang for disrespecting Heinrich, the first prince of the kingdom. Ignoring the attendant's outrage, Wolfgang coldly pointed out that His Highness was the one who carelessly bumped into him. Furious at the perceived disrespect, Prince Heinrich commanded Wolfgang to be silent, absolutely refusing to apologize to a lowly noble. The arrogant prince loudly blamed Wolfgang for the incident, declaring it was overwhelmingly the duke's fault for not getting out of his royal path. The Otome game's primary capture target, first Prince Heinrich Bernhard, finally makes his appearance, masking a spoiled, bratty interior beneath an angelic facade. Glaring at the boy, Wolfgang silently curses the bastard prince destined to annul his engagement and drive his beloved Lulu to utter ruin. Sighing heavily, the Duke questions why the young royal is wandering unsupervised, feeling a sudden surge of sympathy for the king's daily hardships. The Duke sternly warns the arrogant child that such heavily trafficked areas are dangerous, as malicious individuals easily slip through the crowds. Bristling with indignation, Heinrich loudly demands to know why any location would be forbidden to the first prince of the realm. Refusing to budge, the spoiled royal arrogantly proclaims that since the entire kingdom will eventually be his, everyone else must move out of his way. Suddenly, a menacing shadow falls over the boy as Peter Bernhard looms dangerously close. Leaning in with a sinister glare, Peter coldly asks if the prince's logic means no one would care if his highness suddenly vanished. Trembling violently under the intense gaze, a terrified Heinrich stammers out a question before Peter bluntly confirms the death threat. Stepping in quickly, Wolfgang yells at Bernhard for going too far, but the eccentric Duke insists the harsh lesson is entirely necessary. Dismissing the frightened child, Peter sharply commands the prince to go find his guardians and accept a thorough scolding. Before Heinrich can respond, frantic shouts echo down the hallway as the First Knight's Order desperately searches for their missing charge. Spotting the boy, the panicked attendants rush forward in a chaotic swarm to secure the runaway royal. Flailing his arms wildly, Heinrich screams that he is still playing while fiercely resisting his furious guards. The exhausted attendants hastily apologize to the dukes before violently dragging the loudly complaining prince away. Watching the absolute disaster unfold, Wolfgang pities the kingdom's staff for having to deal with such an unbearable child. He mentally notes that the real-life prince is an arrogant terror, completely lacking the refreshing facade his in-game counterpart maintained. Shifting his focus, Peter suddenly blushes furiously and celebrates the glorious fact that Wolfgang finally called him by a special name. Realizing his massive slip-up, Wolfgang internally panics over accidentally shouting the embarrassing Bernhard nickname out loud. Closing the distance, a starry-eyed Peter begs Wolfgang to exclusively use the nickname whenever they are in private. Baffled by the intense reaction, Wolfgang cautiously asks if the eccentric Duke actually hates the ridiculous moniker. Vehemently denying any hatred, Peter passionately encourages his friend to speak far more casually with him. He gleefully points out that combining his first and last names creates a nickname with a wonderfully strange ring to it. Staring blankly, Wolfgang pauses as a sudden cultural realization hits him. While he meant the portmanteau as a modern joke, he suddenly remembers that noble nicknames in this kingdom signify extreme personal intimacy. Feeling incredibly awkward about the one-sided closeness, Wolfgang sheepishly permits Peter to call him whatever he wants in return. Overjoyed by the absolute privilege, Peter freaks out as he frantically tries to invent the perfect nickname for his best friend. Staring with deadpan disbelief, Wolfgang questions if Peter truly considers him a best friend despite constantly repeating the claim. Staring back with pure, unwavering earnestness, Peter declares that his profound friendship is exactly why he wants Wolfgang to remember him. Clenching his fists, the dramatic noble fiercely vows to never surrender his rightful place as Wolfgang's #1 best friend. Sighing heavily at the dramatic outburst, Wolfgang bluntly tells Peter that he is severely exaggerating the situation. Wallowing in self-deprecation, the Duke dryly notes that he barely has any friends, meaning absolutely no one is competing for the spot. Furious at this lack of self-awareness, Peter violently corrects him, shouting that hordes of nobles and ladies are desperately trying to win his favor. Completely ignoring the truth, a sweating Wolfgang forces an awkward laugh and completely dismisses Peter's claims. Softening his intense gaze, Peter smiles gently and expresses immense gratitude for their trivial, light-hearted chats. Boarding his departing carriage, Peter cheerfully bids the acting Duke farewell and asks him to pass along his warmest regards to Lady Louise. Left standing alone in the grand hallway, an exhausted Wolfgang groans about how Peter effortlessly throws him off his game. Reflecting on their long history, Wolfgang suddenly questions if Peter's bizarrely exaggerated speech patterns were actually intentional. A heartwarming epiphany strikes as Wolfgang realizes Peter's distinct, over-the-top voice perfectly allows his face-blind self to easily recognize him. Touched by his friend's secret kindness, Wolfgang resolves to dig up the noble directory and finally practice drawing Peter's face once he returns home. A brief narrative box simply announces that a significant amount of time has finally passed. Outside the academy, Wolfgang celebrates Marcus's graduation, deeply relieved to shed his grueling acting Duke duties as Lulu turns 7. Drowning in paperwork, Wolfgang cries tears of frustration over the horrifying amount of work required for Marcus's succession debut. He frantically lists his endless tasks, counting everything from arranging outfits and catering to finalizing guest seating and estate security. Examining a map, Wolfgang notes that after the soiree, he and Lulu must vacate the Lehrmann territory for the Zonta territory. Burying his face, Wolfgang groans that the overwhelming slum project and his regular duties will absolutely kill him. Hearing a knock, the exhausted Duke realizes he is also handling the massive domestic workload normally assigned to the lady. A timid Lulu peeks through the door, cautiously asking if her father is too busy to talk. Abandoning his paperwork, a weeping Wolfgang welcomes his daughter, declaring her sweet face completely heals his exhaustion. Fidgeting nervously, Lulu shyly asks if there is absolutely anything she can do to help ease his heavy burden. Pointing to the massive stacks, she correctly guesses that the overwhelming paperwork is for Uncle Marcus's upcoming succession. Wolfgang hums in thought as he carefully considers her incredibly sweet request to help. Finding the request adorable, Wolfgang gently explains that this specific task is far too difficult for a child to handle. He warns that any clumsy mistakes during the soiree will cause nobles to ruthlessly question House Lehmann's prestige. Turning to Lulu, Wolfgang affectionately assigns her the crucial task of practicing etiquette so she can properly greet guests. He reminds her that this grand party will be her official debut, meaning nobles expect flawless behavior from Lady Louise. Frowning slightly, Lulu admits Lady Fisher warned her about the incredible trouble hiding beneath high society's glittering surface. She explains the suffocating social rules, noting she isn't even allowed to initiate a conversation with her friend Lady Emma. A diagram confirms Lulu must wait for Emma to speak first because a marquis's daughter severely outranks a count's daughter. Lulu acknowledges she must carefully control her behavior because public gossip could severely damage her future. Wolfgang listens in solemn silence as his young daughter processes the unforgiving realities of noble politics. Cocking his head, Wolfgang gently asks Lulu if she secretly wishes she was a duke's daughter instead. He tempts her with beautiful jewels, elite tutors, the freedom to speak openly, and the chance to marry a prince. Thinking it over, Lulu admits that while studying is fun and dresses sound nice, she isn't fully convinced. Clenching her fists, Lulu firmly declares she strongly prefers being the daughter of House Zonta. Wolfgang smiles warmly at her definitive answer, prompting Lulu to add a secondary reason. Blushing in disgust, Lulu explains that horrifying rumors surrounding the bratty first prince make marrying royalty completely unappealing. Sighing in massive relief, Wolfgang admits he was slightly worried and is glad she definitively despises the prince. Reflecting on his choices, Wolfgang realizes he secretly feared his refusal to accept promotions was unfairly constraining Lulu's potential. Looking up at her father, Lulu nervously asks if she can bring up one more topic. Staring directly into his eyes, she bluntly asks if he ever plans to welcome a new mother into their home. Shocked by the sudden, heavy question, Wolfgang stares back in absolute silence. Recovering his composure, he gently asks Lulu what prompted her to bring up such a serious subject. She explains her tutor claimed Wolfgang is overwhelmed because he performs the duties of both family head and lady. Lowering her head, Lulu notes that noble traditions dictate he must eventually take a second wife to replace Cassandra. Wolfgang closes his eyes and quietly confirms the harsh reality of noble customs. Smiling warmly, he pats his lap and gently calls Lulu over for a hug. Embracing his daughter tightly, Wolfgang sincerely apologizes for making her worry about his workload. He admits with a weak laugh that he is currently on the absolute verge of breaking from the stress. Reassuring her, Wolfgang promises the chaos will completely settle down the moment Marcus officially assumes the ducal title. Holding her close, Wolfgang firmly declares that his primary goal is to always put Lulu's feelings and happiness first. He acknowledges the rule requiring a second wife but adamantly refuses to force a new mother into their home. Looking directly into her eyes, he gently asks Lulu to share her true feelings on the matter. He asks her softly if she genuinely feels that she needs a new mother right now. Staring down nervously, Lulu stammers that her request might sound incredibly selfish. Clenching her fists, she tearfully confesses she only wants her father by her side until she turns 10. She explains that because he is a man, he won't fully understand the complex preparations needed for her adult debut. Taking a deep breath, Lulu requests that he begin searching for a new mother only after she turns 10. Hearing her heartbreaking maturity, Wolfgang silently calls out to Katie in immense sorrow. He laments the cruel kingdom, knowing it constantly forces people to suppress their personal desires for duty. He acknowledges that navigating the rigorous physical and social preparations for a noblewoman's debut is impossible for a single father. Wolfgang mourns that his brilliant daughter has already learned to sacrifice her own childhood to fulfill noble obligations. He curses his past life sensibilities, recognizing his modern desire to protect her innocence clashes with this harsh world. Sobbing uncontrollably, Wolfgang apologizes profusely while Lulu desperately assures him she isn't forcing herself. Smiling through the tears, Lulu finishes her request with unwavering conviction. Embracing him back, she firmly demands that he remain solely her father until the day she turns 10. A sweeping view sets the serene atmosphere for the aftermath of the grand celebration. The quiet moment lingers, building a sense of absolute, peaceful relief. Wolfgang mentally cheered his massive victory, completely exhausted but absolutely thrilled to have survived Marcus's grueling succession ceremony. Recalling the blinding blur of the past 2 weeks, he eagerly planned to crack open a fine bottle of wine since he couldn't drink a drop during the party. Sighing to himself, he playfully admitted that an ice-cold beer would actually hit the spot much better right now. Gazing fondly at Cassandra's portrait, Wolfgang proudly announced to Katie that he had finally graduated from his heavy role as acting Duke. Smiling warmly at the painted canvas, he asked his late wife if she thought he had done a pretty good job holding everything together. He grimaced as he confessed that his legs nearly gave out when His Majesty and the bratty Prince Heinrich unexpectedly crashed the event. Acknowledging House Lehrmann's immense status as one of the kingdom's 5 great houses, Wolfgang noted that sending a royal invitation was strictly mandatory. Clutching his chest, he complained that the king's personal attendance was terrible for his heart, having fully expected the royal brother to appear instead. Shifting his thoughts to Prince Heinrich, Wolfgang mused that the boy had clearly been whipped into shape following the chaotic incident from a year ago. He noted with sheer relief that the prince's bratty exterior had vanished, finally allowing the royal to behave properly in public. Tossing the royal drama aside, Wolfgang ecstatically praised Lulu's flawless etiquette, celebrating the endless compliments she received from the noble guests. Staring at Katie's portrait with tearful pride, he desperately wished she could have seen their daughter shining in her adorable new dress. His smile faded slightly as he remembered Lulu's heartbreaking, mature request to find a new mother once she turned 10. Sighing heavily, a deeply conflicted Wolfgang asked Katie's portrait what he was supposed to do about taking a second wife. A sudden voice interrupted his quiet moment as Marcus cautiously stepped into the room to ask for his older brother's time. Noticing the glass of wine, Marcus softly noted that Wolfgang was enjoying a quiet, intimate drink with his late sister-in-law. Wolfgang warmly praised Marcus for his stellar performance at the ceremony, teasing the young duke about being a massive hit with all the young ladies. Inviting him to sit, Wolfgang proudly declared that it was only natural for his incredibly handsome brother to be popular. Scoffing at the praise, Marcus fired back that he saw Wolfgang getting utterly cornered by desperate women until Peter Bernard had to launch a rescue mission. Wolfgang internally groaned, realizing that Pebernard was completely right about the massive crowd of noble ladies aggressively targeting the empty spot next to him. Brushing off the terrifying thought, Wolfgang muttered that he couldn't understand why anyone would even want a widower in his 30s. Shifting to a highly formal tone, Wolfgang officially congratulated Marcus on successfully inheriting the monumental title of Duke Lehrmann. Flinching at the heavy title, Marcus desperately begged his older brother to stop calling him that. Staring nervously at the floor, the newly crowned duke solemnly asked if Wolfgang was really moving out of the grand estate. Wolfgang gently explained that since Marcus was now the true duke, it would be highly inappropriate for him and Lulu to overstay their welcome. Panicking instantly, Marcus threw his dignity aside and frantically begged Wolfgang to completely cancel his moving plans. Utterly baffled by the dramatic outburst, Wolfgang questioned why he would stay when the official handover was already flawlessly completed. Reminding his panicking brother of their support system, Wolfgang pointed out that the incredibly capable Christoph was staying behind as the House Lehrmann butler. Tears suddenly welling in his eyes, a visibly trembling Marcus completely broke down and whined that he was going to be too lonely. Lunging forward with a pathetic wail, the teenage duke desperately clung to Wolfgang and begged his older brother not to leave him. Catching a strong whiff of liquor, a shocked Wolfgang suddenly realized the weeping teen was completely hammered despite maintaining a stoic face. While Marcus sobbed uncontrollably into his chest, Wolfgang recalled that the strict kingdom forbade alcohol until 18, meaning this was likely Marcus's very first time drinking. Awkwardly patting his crying brother's back, Wolfgang noted the boy's hilariously weepy drunk phase and resolved to monitor his future alcohol intake. Sniffling pathetically, Marcus confessed that his entire safety net relied on Wolfgang bailing him out whenever things inevitably went wrong. Wolfgang's sweat dropped at the incredibly flawed logic, loudly questioning when exactly things were supposed to get bad while his brother mumbled apologies. Pouting like a petulant child, Marcus bitterly accused Wolfgang of hiding massive secrets from him while freely trusting the butler. Tilting his head in genuine confusion, Wolfgang gently asked the drunk teenager what important things he was talking about. Dropping a massive emotional bombshell, a tearful Marcus confessed his deep hurt over never knowing about Wolfgang's severe facial blindness. Wolfgang gently explained to his weeping brother that he hid the truth because Marcus was still so small back then. Wiping his tears, Marcus aggressively retorted that he was already physically larger than his older brother. Glaring with frustration, the young duke accused Wolfgang of constantly acting this way. Marcus bitterly complained that his older brother always tried to shoulder every burden completely on his own. Desperately clinging to Wolfgang, the crying teenager begged to be taken along wherever he was going. Realizing how much little Marcus had grown, Wolfgang sincerely apologized for not communicating properly with him. Staring intently, Marcus cautiously asked if his older brother was actually capable of recognizing his face. Wolfgang warmly confirmed that he memorized his only brother's face by drawing it the moment he realized the technique worked. Overwhelmed by the touching confession, a tearful Marcus gripped his brother in a tight embrace. Refusing to let go, the stubborn teen abruptly demanded they completely cancel the scheduled move. When Wolfgang argued that he and Lulu would be a burden, Marcus fiercely denied the ridiculous claim. Whining like a child, Marcus jealously complained that it was completely unfair for Lulu to get all of his brother's attention. Stunned by the absolute desperation in his brother's voice, Wolfgang stood completely speechless. Staring into those pleading eyes, Wolfgang mentally admitted he was hopelessly weak against his cute younger brother. Sighing in absolute defeat, the older brother finally surrendered and agreed to the selfish demand. The next morning, bright sunlight and chirping birds signaled the start of a peaceful new day. Peeking into the room, an innocent Lulu asked her groggy uncle why he wasn't joining them for breakfast. Tilting her head in concern, the sweet girl genuinely asked if his tummy was hurting him. Nursing a vicious hangover, a miserable Marcus swore off alcohol and desperately wished to crawl into a dark hole. Taking him literally, a confused Lulu helpfully offered him a spot inside her own closet. Sweating nervously, the embarrassed duke quickly declined his niece's adorable offer. Ultimately, the big move was officially postponed until Lulu's true name bestowal ceremony, a ritual that appraises magical power at age 10. For the next 3 years, Wolfgang would manage the Zonta territory through quarterly business trips. Meanwhile, Lulu was absolutely thrilled to remain close enough to frequently visit her best friend Emma. During a visit to the Fisher estate, an excited Emma quickly whisked Lulu away to play in the lush garden. Welcoming her guest, Lady Fisher thanked Lord Zonta for coming and admitted she had an important matter to discuss. Gesturing toward the tea table, the noblewoman gracefully introduced the young lady sitting beside her. Standing up with perfect elegance, the young woman formally greeted Lord Zonta. She proudly introduced herself as Lena Fisher, the esteemed eldest daughter of the Marquis. Bowing respectfully, Lena sincerely thanked the Duke for the beautiful flowers he sent for her coming-of-age celebration. Staring at the healthy girl, Wolfgang remembered that in the original game, this exact character tragically lost her legs and her mind. He realized that his active interference during the monster attack had successfully rewritten her dark future. Knowing her secret survival, he had deliberately sent gorgeous ranunculus flowers to properly celebrate her miraculous debutante ball. He quietly admired the beautiful woman she had grown into, noting her radiant golden hair and striking amethyst eyes. Her bright, living smile served as a powerful beacon of hope that Lulu's tragic destiny could also be completely averted. Lady Fisher playfully teased her flustered daughter, revealing that Lena was so thrilled she wore his flowers as a hair ornament. Smiling warmly, Wolfgang expressed his delight and mentioned that he and Lulu had picked the fluffy pink flowers together. He smoothly complimented the young woman, noting that fresh floral ornaments must have suited her perfectly. Blushing deeply at the handsome Duke's praise, a shy Lena softly thanked him. Shifting back to business, Wolfgang asked Lady Fisher about the important consultation regarding her eldest daughter. The Duke nervously confirms he will attend the evening party at the royal palace, despite desperately wanting to decline. Lady Fisher asks if he could support Lena during the event since she and her husband must host foreign guests. Wolfgang points out that he doesn't have time to properly memorize Lena's face by drawing her before the party. Lady Fisher reveals she initially asked her cousin for help, but he suddenly cancelled due to a sprained ankle. Deducing her true motive, Wolfgang notes she simply wants him to act as a physical shield against other men. He considers suggesting Marcus, who is closer to Lena's age, but realizes that would instantly spawn groundless romance rumors. Blushing nervously, Lena apologizes for the sudden request, confessing she is deeply anxious about attending evening parties alone. Acknowledging that the Fisher family has always looked after Lulu, Wolfgang formally accepts their request for help. He agrees to chat beside Lena as a human shield until her parents return, provided they coordinate a specific meeting time. Wolfgang mentally notes he will just call on Pebernard for backup if the situation spirals out of control. A cheerful Lulu suddenly runs up to greet Lena and thanks her for coming over. Adjusting a floral wreath on her head, Lena blushes and compliments Lulu's beautiful flower crown. Lulu humbly waves off the praise, comparing her initial clumsy attempts to Emma's superior crafting skills. Beaming brightly, Lulu turns to Wolfgang and proudly presents him with his own flower crown. Completely unable to resist his daughter's adorable gift, Wolfgang silently accepts his fate. Later, Wolfgang dramatically poses outside the venue, wearing the delicate flower crown while Marcus stares in sheer disbelief. Fast-forwarding to the palace party, Wolfgang strides confidently through the grand doors. He sternly reminds a nervous Marcus to relax before the young duke officially waves goodbye to his older brother. Murmurs erupt throughout the hall as the nobles admire Count Zonta's striking beauty and whisper about his heroics. A bitter noble glares from afar, complaining that Wolfgang arrogantly turned down a royal promotion. Ignoring the toxic gossip, Wolfgang mentally complains about his hatred of socializing and desperately wishes he was home with Lulu. Spotting the Fisher family across the massive hall, Wolfgang notes they arrived much earlier than he did. He struggles to memorize Lena's distinct outfit because his facial blindness prevents him from recognizing her features. A noble standing beside him notes that Lena's overwhelming beauty effortlessly draws the gaze of every man in the room. The noble reveals that Lena is a certified genius and a 3-time winner of the Academy's prestigious beauty pageant. Wolfgang completely understands why Lena desperately needs a human shield against the kingdom's aggressive suitors. Checking the time, he decides to grab a quick bite to eat before his scheduled meeting with Lena. As he turns toward the food, a loud, familiar voice suddenly calls out his title. Wolfgang freezes as Peter Bernard aggressively marches toward him with a massive, arrogant grin. Pointing directly at Peter, Wolfgang confidently shouts, "Walter," proving he finally recognizes his friend's face. Peter bursts into laughter, thrilled that Wolfgang finally achieved the impossible and recognized him without prompting. Wolfgang mentally reflects on the grueling year he spent memorizing Peter's face from the peerage records. Overjoyed by the success, Peter declares he is ready to go home right now while Wolfgang notes Walter is his new nickname. A sophisticated woman suddenly approaches, lightly scolding Peter for abruptly abandoning her mid-conversation. Staring at the elegant lady, Wolfgang realizes this is his very first time seeing Peter with a woman. The woman smoothly introduces herself, revealing that her brother talks about Lord Zonta so often she has lost count. Bowing politely, Beatrice introduces herself as the eldest daughter of House Bernd and thanks Wolfgang for looking after her brother. Wolfgang formally introduces himself, surprised to discover that the eccentric Pebernard actually has a sister. Peter quickly steps between them, warning Wolfgang not to fall in love with Beatrice because she is already engaged. Rejecting the absurd accusation, Wolfgang dryly notes that Peter is perfectly fine with demanding his total devotion as a best friend. Beatrice giggles softly, teasing her flustered brother about his incredibly obvious affection for Lord Zonta. Changing the subject, Beatrice reveals she met her fiancé while studying abroad in Chendal during her student days. She explains she only returned home recently, which is why she hadn't met Wolfgang until tonight. Wolfgang politely asks about her partner, only to freeze when she happily admits he is actually 9 years younger than her. Doing the math, Wolfgang realizes she met a child under 10 years old while studying abroad as an older teenager. Before he can panic, Beatrice clarifies that her beloved partner belongs to the long-lived dragonoid race. Wolfgang remembers the dragonoid priest from Karl's orphanage, recalling their lifespan is more than twice that of a human. Beatrice notes that dragonoids mature differently, meaning her 10-year-old partner is actually considered an adolescent in his culture. Bringing up the kingdom's marriage laws, Wolfgang bluntly asks Peter why he hasn't heard any rumors about his own engagement. Wolfgang reminds the evasive duke that since they are the same age, Peter is rapidly approaching the ideal male marriage age of 30. Looking unusually solemn, Peter quietly admits he knows he has to marry eventually. Suddenly, a frantic Lord Fisher sprints toward them and desperately calls out both of their names. Confused by the panic, Wolfgang questions if it is already time for his scheduled meeting with Lena. Gasping for air, a terrified Lord Fisher urgently demands to know if either of them has seen his daughter. Peter quickly denies seeing her, stating he has been glued to Lord Zonta since the palace doors opened. Shaking with panic, Lord Fisher explains that Lena was right beside them just moments ago. Sweating profusely, the frantic father screams that his beloved daughter has completely disappeared. A gentle breeze sweeps through the quiet exterior of the grand estate. Panic shatters the peaceful atmosphere as a guest frantically announces that Lena has completely vanished in the brief moment they looked away. The surrounding nobles gasp in genuine shock at the sudden, alarming revelation of her disappearance. A deeply distressed woman cries out for her husband as the tension in the room rapidly escalates. She explains with mounting dread that she has already scoured the restrooms and the lounge to absolutely no avail. Wolfgang calmly steps into the chaotic fray to ask the frantic parents for the exact details of what transpired. The trembling mother recounts that Lena quietly left her seat while they were distracted by a conversation with friends. She clarifies that the young girl had simply excused herself to visit the restroom completely alone. The mother's panic spiked intensely when her daughter failed to return after a reasonable amount of time had passed. Taking matters into her own hands, she went searching only to find the immediate area completely empty. The father firmly states that Lena would never vanish without a word, heavily implying that something terrible has happened. Lady Fisher bitterly blames herself for not accompanying the girl, noting her daughter's sheer inexperience with grand evening parties. An aide gently interrupts the tense moment to remind Lord Fisher of his impending, unavoidable meeting with the remaining guests. Wolfgang steps forward with commanding confidence, urging the worried parents to leave the delicate search and rescue operation to him. He acutely advises them to proceed with their scheduled duties, warning that causing a public scene would only severely harm Lena's reputation. Another noble fully agrees with Wolfgang's tactical assessment and quickly recruits Beatrice to assist in the stealthy operation. Beatrice confidently accepts the task, noting she easily remembers Lena's beautiful face from their very recent introduction. Wolfgang expertly outlines a plan to discreetly inform the royal guards and initiate a completely covert search. Lord Fisher addresses the gathered group with an expression of profound, desperate gratitude. He solemnly implores Lord Zonta, Lord Burnt, and Beatrice to bring his precious daughter back safely. Taking charge of his own noble duties, Lord Fisher instructs Angelica to coordinate the search while he distracts the remaining guests. The makeshift rescue team immediately disperses into the sprawling castle to begin their urgent hunt for the missing girl. Wolfgang mentally prepares himself for the task, thankful that he meticulously memorized the intricate details of Lena's dress. He quickly relays the critical situation to the royal guards to mobilize a silent but incredibly thorough sweep of the premises. The female members of the search party strategically branch off to investigate private areas that are typically restricted to men. Meanwhile, Bernard takes point on actively sweeping the vast, crowded interior halls of the manor. Assigned to the sprawling outdoor grounds, Wolfgang furiously navigates through the dense crowd while desperately seeking the garden exit. Stepping into the moonlit gardens, he prays for Lena's safety while reflecting on how her timeline has already fundamentally changed. His focused thoughts are abruptly shattered by the muffled sounds of a couple engaging in a scandalous, hidden rendezvous. Startled by Wolfgang's sudden appearance, the hidden couple shrieks in pure panic as he accidentally stumbles directly into their secret spot. Wolfgang hastily apologizes and awkwardly excuses himself while the enraged man furiously demands his identity. Frustrated by the awkward encounter, Wolfgang curses the utter lack of decency in the royal gardens and demands the guards crack down on such behavior. Shaking off the brief distraction, his sharp ears suddenly catch a faint, muffled groan emanating from the deeper shadows of the garden. He recognizes a woman's stifled voice and overhears a sinister man violently threatening her to remain completely silent. The unseen assailant lets out a vile chuckle while sadistically mocking the terrified victim about the thrill of being caught. Wolfgang's blood boils with righteous, uncontrollable fury as the disgusting creep promises to completely ruin the helpless woman. Torn between his primary mission to find Lena and the immediate danger before him, he frantically scans the area for any patrolling guards. The horrifying thought that his own daughter Lulu might face such vile scum in the future completely shatters all of his hesitation. Restricted from using his powerful magic within the palace walls, he bravely resolves to physically rescue the lady and apprehend the bastard using raw force. Charging headfirst into the darkness, Wolfgang silently prays the confrontation ends swiftly since he is terribly inexperienced in actual hand-to-hand combat. The sinister assailant praises Lena's beauty as he looms over her in the shadows. Wolfgang furiously interrupts the assault, demanding the piece of trash get lost as he strikes a decisive blow. The attacker slumps to the ground completely unconscious, prompting Wolfgang to quickly turn his attention to Lena. Wolfgang urgently calls out her name to confirm her identity as she lies terrified on the cold grass. Lena weakly gasps in the darkness, clearly traumatized by the harrowing ordeal she just endured. A tense moment of silence hangs in the heavy air as Wolfgang quickly assesses the distressing situation. Wolfgang swiftly removes his jacket and offers a gentle apology while carefully draping it over her exposed shoulders. Recognizing her noble savior, Lena hesitantly murmurs Lord Zonta's name through her shock. Wolfgang kneels down and gently asks the trembling girl if she is hurt or in any physical pain. The sheer relief of being rescued suddenly overwhelms Lena, and she bursts into uncontrollable tears. She wails openly into the quiet night, releasing all the terrifying emotions she had been holding back. Wolfgang warmly reassures her that she is completely safe now before suggesting they return to her worried parents. Lena continues to sob heavily as she desperately tries to process the violent trauma. Shielding her view from the unconscious attacker, Wolfgang softly tells her she does not need to look in that direction. Wolfgang internally seethes with the desire to burn the attacker to a crisp, but he acknowledges that using magic here would publicly disgrace Lena. He glares down at the unconscious man with absolute disgust burning in his eyes. Deciding on a non-magical but effective punishment, Wolfgang resolves to strip the man so he can wallow in his own utter shame. He forcefully tosses the man's garments away to completely humiliate the would-be assailant. He logically deduces that calling the patrol knights now will make the man's vile intentions blindingly obvious to everyone. Wolfgang coldly remarks that he might as well completely drag this pathetic bastard's reputation through the mud while he has the chance. Turning back to Lena, he gently urges her to stand so they can escape the area before anyone else sees them. Lena apologetically admits through her tears that her legs are far too weak to support her weight. Wolfgang immediately apologizes for his oversight and warmly offers to carry her instead. He tenderly scoops the frightened girl into his strong arms to ensure she is completely comfortable. A quiet moment passes as he secures his grip and mentally prepares to leave the secluded garden. He walks steadily through the shadowy garden paths with the trembling young noblewoman resting securely in his embrace. Lena tearfully apologizes again, but Wolfgang kindly reassures her that she can hold on to him as tightly as she needs. He explains that burying her face in his chest will perfectly hide her identity from any random passers-by. Lena softly agrees to his tactical suggestion and presses herself closely against his protective frame. The pair quietly navigate the expansive outskirts of the royal estate in total, comforting silence. Spotting a patrolling royal guard in the distance, Wolfgang immediately calls out to get the man's attention. The startled guard loudly recognizes Lord Zonta, but Wolfgang swiftly shushes him to keep the sensitive matter completely discreet. Wolfgang calmly and quietly informs the attentive guard that the missing Lena has finally been located. He bluntly explains that he knocked out a man who was attempting to force himself on the young lady. Instructing the guard to apprehend the unconscious man in the back gazebo, Wolfgang swiftly secures the perpetrator's inevitable arrest. A second guard respectfully offers to immediately open a private, secure room for Lord Zonta and the rescued lady. Wolfgang gratefully accepts the assistance while the guard rushes off to urgently inform Marquis Fischer and his wife. The frantic mother bursts into the private room, crying out her beloved daughter's name in sheer desperation. Lena emotionally cries out for her mother as the two immediately rush toward each other. The devastated mother embraces her daughter tightly, sobbing over the terrible ordeal they have all just miraculously survived. The distressed mother embraces her daughter, deeply regretting that she had not stayed by Lena's side the entire time. Marquis Fischer calls out to Lord Zonta, urgently asking him to wait before departing. The grateful father expresses profound thanks, noting that Wolfgang has remarkably saved both Emma and Lena. Wolfgang humbly dismisses the praise, instead apologizing to Lena for not finding her sooner and sparing her the terrifying ordeal. Stepping forward, Lena shyly admits that she felt immense relief the moment she saw his face during the rescue. She bows deeply and sincerely thanks Wolfgang, proudly calling him her true savior. Wolfgang quietly observes the young girl, noting with relief that her voice has finally stopped trembling. Impressed by her inner strength, Wolfgang listens as Lena expresses a deep desire to repay him for his kindness and for borrowing his jacket. He quickly waves off her concern, assuring the young lady that repayment is entirely unnecessary. The Fischers fiercely insist on rewarding him, arguing that they would not feel right letting his heroism go unacknowledged. Yielding to their persistence, Wolfgang requests that a fully recovered Lena invite his daughter Louise to a tea party. He warmly adds that his little Lulu looks up to the older girl with immense admiration. Overjoyed by the prospect, Lena declares that hosting the adorable Louise is a genuine reward rather than a repayment. With a bright smile returning to her face, she eagerly promises to send the invitation. Wolfgang privately reflects that attending a tea party hosted by a lady of the 5 great houses will be an incredibly precious learning experience for Lulu. He confidently imagines his daughter's thrilled reaction at the grand chance to spend time with her idol. Pebernard casually approaches Wolfgang from behind, teasing his friend for being so remarkably active during the crisis. He commends Wolfgang on a job well done after witnessing the royal guards haul the scoundrel away. Wolfgang modestly deflects the compliment, respectfully acknowledging that his friend worked just as hard. Noting the exhausting commotion, Pebernard invites him to a nearby private room he prepared with snacks. He points out that Wolfgang is officially grounded until the royal guards finish their mandatory questioning anyway. Frustration suddenly boils over as Wolfgang curses the captured scoundrel for delaying his departure. He desperately whines about wanting to rush home immediately just to see his precious Lulu again. Sighing at the dramatic outburst, Pebernard chuckles that his friend remains as shamelessly doting as ever. Wolfgang violently rejects Pebernard's company as a substitute for his daughter, though his friend mockingly tells him to just put up with it. Meanwhile, back in the safety of the private room, the traumatized Lena finally begins to settle surveying the newly discovered dungeon in East Tyrell. Wolfgang immediately recognizes its dangerously familiar terrain. He realizes with mounting dread that this is the most difficult and brutal dungeon from the Alphon game. Steeling his absolute resolve, the devoted father prepares to conquer the treacherous depths to protect his daughter's future smile. Exactly 1 month passes quietly after the chaotic events of the evening party. Having left Lulu safely with Marcus, Wolfgang attends to a routine business trip at the sprawling Zonta estate. His quiet meal is abruptly interrupted by Hans Ildevo, who politely requests a brief moment of his lord's time. Wolfgang prompts the young cat beastman to share his urgent news, noting Hans is one of Christoph's dedicated disciples. He silently reflects on how a younger Lulu mercifully rescued the battered boy from the roadside 4 years ago. Proving surprisingly capable under Christoph's guidance, the young beastman quickly rose to become head butler and now bears a critical report. Hans urgently informs his lord that an entirely unregistered dungeon has just been discovered near East Tyrell village. He details how the dungeon was uncovered during a monster search, prompting the village to hire local adventurers for an immediate extermination. With monster numbers multiplying rapidly and the village's protective barrier stone nearly depleted, the locals desperately plead for House Zonta's aid. Awaiting immediate orders, Hans watches as Wolfgang decisively declares he is heading to the vulnerable village at once. Startled by the sudden departure, Hans quickly agrees to accompany his lord and rushes off to prepare the carriage. Wolfgang hastily excuses himself from the table and asks the remaining staff to clean up his unfinished meal. A heavy sense of dread settles over him as he recalls the terrible gameplay memories associated with East Tyrell. Arriving at the gloomy East Tyrell cave, the party is briefed by weary adventurers who have already attempted several dangerous dives. Griselda Osti warns him that the dungeon completely nullifies light magic, severely restricting visibility to an arm's length. She sternly advises Lord Zonta to stick incredibly close to the group so he does not wander into the suffocating darkness. Griselda explains their frustrating lack of progress, noting that changing routes always inexplicably loops them back to the entrance. The exploration has completely stalled because they cannot locate any passage leading down to the monster-filled lower floors. She grimly adds that the monster population is unnaturally high, with some savage beasts violently cannibalizing their own kind. Suddenly ambushed from the deep shadows, Wolfgang curses his inability to activate his mystic eye fast enough. The adventurers scream out a frantic warning and rally fiercely to protect Lord Zonta from the vicious monster attack. Hans bluntly points out that while Wolfgang's mystic eye is normally an overpowered cheat, it is completely useless in this pitch-black environment. Wolfgang sighs at his butler's harsh but utterly accurate tactical assessment of his compromised abilities. Hans firmly declares that joining the investigation will only make Wolfgang a fatal burden against such a catastrophic environmental mismatch. Laughing off the heavy tension, Wolfgang is quickly checked over by the concerned adventurers to ensure he sustained no serious injuries. He warmly apologizes for causing trouble during his stubborn inspection and dismisses his minor wound as a mere scratch. Griselda reassures him that the battered party was already planning to retreat to the village for a strategic consultation anyway. Pondering their bizarre looping issue, Wolfgang asks if a widespread confusion spell might be responsible for constantly resetting their progress. Rejecting his own confusion theory, he confidently deduces that the seasoned adventurers are actually falling victim to a hidden warp trap. He expertly explains that the pitch-black environment perfectly conceals a spatial trap designed to forcibly teleport them without their knowledge. Griselda's eyes widen in sudden realization as she finally understands why their deep dives always magically deposit them back at the start. Another adventurer notes it felt deeply unnatural for seasoned professionals to miss a monster's heavy scent until it was directly on top of them. He connects the final dots, concluding that they were likely teleporting directly into the monster's paths rather than being seamlessly ambushed. The seasoned adventurers stare in sheer awe at Wolfgang's incredible ability to deduce the complex trap from such a brief, chaotic inspection. Sweating nervously under their immense praise, Wolfgang weakly lies that he simply read an old report about a similar dungeon gimmick. Internally, he confirms with absolute terrifying certainty that this cave matches the exact specifications of Alphon's most notoriously brutal dungeon. Wolfgang mentally curses the hellish combination of darkness and warp traps, dreading the fact that a mandatory true ending item is hidden at the very bottom. Recalling his past life, Wolfgang remembers being wiped out countless times in this specific dungeon because the item drops were too tempting to ignore. He acknowledges that seeing the ground in the dark is surprising and admits his shock at finding the infamous East Tyrell dungeon hidden within Zonta territory. He deduces that careful observation of the ground reveals when a warp occurs, theorizing that repeatedly testing the fixed destinations will eventually uncover the route forward. Nostalgia washes over him as he recalls mapping the game's randomized floors with pencil and paper because online walkthroughs were entirely useless. He muses that the real-world mechanics might differ slightly but recalls a past report that perfectly aligns with his current theory. An adventurer eagerly suggests heading back inside to map the warps, but Wolfgang firmly shuts down the dangerous idea. He strictly forbids any further reckless exploration, warning the seasoned adventurers that this dungeon's difficulty far exceeds their current capabilities. The adventurer argues that failing to quickly locate and destroy the monster nest will lead to a disastrous outcome. Wolfgang finishes the grim thought, confirming that a monster stampede is the inevitable result. He explains that a stampede causes deep-dwelling monsters to exponentially multiply and overflow into the outside world, noting the dungeon is terrifyingly close to this breaking point. He solemnly remembers that preventing these catastrophic overflows was a primary goal in the original Alphon game. Revealing his backup plan, Wolfgang announces he has already summoned the combined Knight Orders of both House Zonta and House Lehmann. He officially suspends all interior exploration until reinforcements arrive, ordering everyone to focus entirely on holding the exterior line. Staring intently at the group, he declares that he refuses to let experienced fighters die a meaningless death. Deeply moved by his protective nature, the adventurers bow their heads and respectfully accept his strategic command. An adventurer suggests their group take turns keeping watch near the entrance since they can still fight effectively outside. Hans quietly interrupts to question if Wolfgang is truly fit for watch duty after completely depleting his mana to refill the village's barrier stone. Completely ignoring the serious question, Wolfgang practically vibrates with joy as he brandishes an unopened letter from his precious Lulu. The adorable letter details her daily adventures riding horses with Uncle Marcus and baking a delicious apple pie with Dorothea. Reading her wish to share the pie with her father, Wolfgang vows to work incredibly hard so he can rush back home. Waving off Hans's legitimate concerns, Wolfgang enthusiastically claims he brought plenty of mana recovery potions to sustain himself. Hans fiercely scolds his lord, reminding him that the powerful potions cause severe side effects if consumed repeatedly. The strict beastman practically begs Wolfgang to treat the dangerous concoctions strictly as an absolute last resort. 10 tense days pass before a frantic guard suddenly shatters the silence by screaming Lord Zonta's name. Wolfgang calmly asks for an update as the breathless guard apologizes for interrupting his rest. The terrified guard reports a massive abnormality inside the dungeon just as Wolfgang charges forward to meet the threat. The narrator notes that during the 10-day wait, the combined Knight Orders had successfully joined forces to cautiously resume the investigation. As monster numbers continued to aggressively multiply, a desperate dispatch request was finally sent to the royal family's elite units. Wolfgang demands an immediate status report regarding the combined elite and adventurer units currently exploring the second floor. The guard gleefully relays a magical communication confirming that the strike team has finally located the monster nest. The good news sours instantly as the guard explains a fierce battle provoked the agitated horde into rushing the exit. Wolfgang realizes with absolute horror that a massive wave of monsters is about to violently overflow into the outside world. Shouting for his trusted butler, Wolfgang is immediately answered by a deeply focused Hans. He orders Hans to wake the sleeping reserves immediately so every capable fighter can meet the incoming horde head-on. Hans asks for Wolfgang's position, prompting the Lord to aggressively promise he will burn the entire monstrous wave to ash outside the cave. A terrified guard screams Wolfgang's name as the sheer volume of monsters threatens to break the defensive line. The interior guards hit their absolute breaking point as a horrifying tide of shrieking beasts bursts from the cave. Staring down the monstrous avalanche, Wolfgang fiercely commands the beasts to stay back. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he unleashes a devastating torrent of magical flames directly into the rushing horde. The surrounding knights watch in pure awe, completely stunned that he annihilated so many beasts without a single incantation. Wolfgang casually apologizes for the mess and tasks the awestruck men with cleaning up the few monsters that slipped past his inferno. A colossal pillar of roaring fire violently engulfs the remaining beasts in a breathtaking display of raw power. Hans quietly observes the devastation, noting that his lord truly is an unparalleled cheat when he can actually see his targets. The surviving monsters shriek in agony as the relentless flames consume their twisted bodies. Catching his breath, Wolfgang scans the battlefield and notes the enemy numbers have drastically thinned. An elite knight bursts from the dungeon entrance and frantically calls out to Lord Zonta. The battered soldier desperately apologizes for failing to contain the massive horde escaping to the surface. Wolfgang warmly praises the exhausted man for successfully locating the nest and assures him he did an excellent job. The newly emerged knights stare in absolute disbelief at the raging inferno completely blocking the cavern entrance. Realizing the flames are still actively burning the horde, the elite soldiers quickly grasp the sheer scale of Wolfgang's power. Searing heat radiates across the rocky terrain as the last of the escaping beasts crumble into ash. The remaining adventurers smirk confidently, viewing the absolute destruction exactly as they expected from their powerful lord. They realize the magical fire harmlessly ignores everything except the monsters, making their mop-up duty an absolute breeze. The seasoned fighters excitedly rally together, thrilled to finally battle in the open air without the suffocating darkness. Drawing their weapons with renewed vigor, the men vow to slaughter every last surviving beast. Hans rushes to Wolfgang's side as the Lord calls out to him amidst the dying embers. Panting heavily from the immense magical exertion, Wolfgang notes with relief that the chaotic battlefield is finally calming down. Hans expresses deep concern over his lord's pale complexion, but Wolfgang weakly waves it off as simple exhaustion. Shifting his focus entirely, Wolfgang stares intently at the smoking cavern entrance with a sudden, brilliant spark of inspiration. He turns to Hans and boldly questions if they could aggressively use this exact same incineration method to clear the rest of the dungeon. A quiet calm briefly settles over the lush, surrounding forest. Standing atop a freshly constructed wooden watchtower, Wolfgang surveys the expansive area below. He marvels aloud at the spectacular sight of the massive military formation preparing for battle. Hans stands beside him, vehemently arguing that the enormous burden of this plan is far too great for his lord to bear alone. Wolfgang calmly counters his butler's protests by pointing out that nobody had a better alternative. A month and a half after the East Tyrell dungeon discovery, this large-scale monster extermination operation was organized entirely around his bold proposal. The intricate plan utilizes boundary stones and explosive magic to drive the beasts out, allowing Wolfgang to burn them from his elevated vantage point while ground soldiers mop up the stragglers. Hans grimly summarizes that they are intentionally recreating the previous chaotic accident to wipe out the entire horde at once. Wolfgang acknowledges the sheer recklessness of his strategy, recalling how he had to stubbornly convince everyone to agree to it. He reflects that elite troops struggled and died in the pitch-black dungeon, making a drawn-out battle far too risky to tolerate. Driven by his duty as the ruling lord, Wolfgang resolves to push his limits and end the terrifying crisis here and now. He privately vows to completely eradicate the dungeon threat so the land will be perfectly safe for his precious Lulu when she moves to the territory in the future. Hans warmly notes his lord's unwavering devotion to his daughter just as a knight suddenly shouts Wolfgang's name. The frantic scout reports that the shield of the Whirlwind adventuring party has successfully reached the monster nest on the second floor. He confirms that the explosive assault is completely ready to begin the exact moment Lord Zonta gives the signal. Without a single second of hesitation, Wolfgang firmly issues the command to commence the operation. A massive, deafening explosion rocks the earth as magical fire erupts deep within the cavern. A terrifying chorus of screeches echoes from the depths as the agitated monster swarm violently surges toward the exit. Thrusting his hand forward, Wolfgang immediately commands his devastating magical flames to burn the encroaching horde. A colossal inferno instantaneously engulfs the cavern entrance to incinerate the rushing beasts. A commanding officer orders his knights not to flinch, reminding the brave men that their lord's magical fire only harms monsters. The ground troops clash fiercely with the charred, surviving beasts that manage to slip past the raging inferno. Swords swing and blood splatters as the elite soldiers execute their mop-up duty with brutal efficiency. Spotting a vulnerable section of the defensive line getting rapidly overwhelmed, Wolfgang swiftly redirects his magical bombardment. The saved soldiers scream out their immense gratitude as Wolfgang's precise flames reduce their attackers to ash. A screeching beast suddenly lunges aggressively toward a distracted, terrified knight. Wolfgang instantly blasts the leaping monster out of the air before it can sink its claws into the helpless man. Watching his lord sweat profusely, a panicked Hans warns Wolfgang that he is dangerously overexerting his magical reserves. He desperately begs Wolfgang to conserve his energy and trust the elite soldiers below to handle the remaining stragglers. Wolfgang fiercely rejects the plea, refusing to let any more allied knights die because he cannot see an end to the endless swarm. Panting heavily, he nervously wonders if the dungeon harbored far more monsters than their initial scouting reports estimated. Down below, the elite troops cry out in shock as massive, giant monster variants suddenly barrel out of the cavern. Gritting his teeth through the sheer exhaustion, Wolfgang pushes his absolute limits to unleash another devastating volley of fire. Hans cries out that no matter how strong his lord is, his mana will eventually run dry if he continues this reckless bombardment. A triumphant shout suddenly pierces the chaotic din of the battlefield as a knight calls up to the watchtower. The ecstatic soldier announces that the final monster has fallen and urges Lord Zonta to leave the remaining cleanup to the ground squads. Gasping deeply for air, a completely drained Wolfgang realizes the brutal, agonizing battle has finally concluded. His trembling legs give out entirely, causing him to collapse backward onto the hard wooden planks of the tower. Staring up at the clear sky, he breathes a heavy sigh of relief and whispers that he can finally return home. A smiling Hans praises his lord for his incredible effort but cheerfully reminds him that they are not completely finished with everything just yet. Down. Her anxious mother fusses over her endlessly, offering warm drinks and suggesting a doctor while they wait for her father. Lena reassures her mother that she is perfectly fine, attributing her absolute safety entirely to Lord Zonta's timely intervention. A deep blush colors her cheeks as she recalls how he gallantly carried her all the way back when she was too weak to walk. Her mother playfully teases that she was treated just like a fairy-tale princess, prompting a flustered reaction from the girl. Left alone with her quiet thoughts, Lena softly whispers Lord Zonta's name with newfound admiration. Wolfgang starts to express his deep gratitude to Hans for all his invaluable help. His words suddenly trail off into a confused murmur as a wave of intense exhaustion violently hits him. Hans cries out in sudden alarm as he watches his lord's body begin to fail. Wolfgang weakly tries to wave off the concern by claiming he just got a little dizzy. He completely loses his balance and begins to collapse backward into the dirt. Hans frantically rushes forward to catch the stumbling noble before he hits the ground. The terrified butler aggressively scolds his lord for falsely claiming to be perfectly fine. Hans furiously reminds Wolfgang that using too much mana could literally kill him. Producing an emergency mana potion he brought just in case, Hans quickly hands it over. He strictly orders Wolfgang to drink the bitter concoction immediately and get some rest. The loyal butler confidently promises to handle all the remaining cleanup operations himself. Wolfgang smiles weakly and notes that his dedicated butler truly is brilliantly dependable. Passing off the heavy burden, he asks Hans to wake him in exactly 2 hours. Hans respectfully accepts the order and wishes his exhausted lord a good night's rest. The narrator confirms they successfully managed to stop the devastating monster stampede in East Tyrell. Grateful villagers bow and cheer down below as the cleared nest finally stops the endless flow of monsters. Wolfgang mentally strategizes that opening the newly found dungeon to adventurers could deeply enrich the unremarkable Zonta territory. Hans politely interrupts his lord's deep thoughts to deliver another precious letter from Lady Louise. Gripping the letter tightly, Wolfgang throws his head back and whines dramatically that he just wants to go home. The sheer exhaustion of his endless administrative duties weighs heavily on his slumping shoulders. The narrator notes that despite his desperate wishes to leave, duty kept him firmly anchored to the territory. It took another grueling month to fully conclude the extermination operation before he could finally set off for home. Riding in a rattling carriage, Wolfgang apologizes to Hans for dragging him all the way back to the Lehrmann estate. Hans bluntly states he could never let his incredibly gaunt lord make the long trip completely alone. The butler scolds him once again for working relentlessly without a break after burning his mana to life-threatening levels. Wolfgang softly explains that his heart breaks every time he reads Lulu's lonely letters asking when he will return. He justifies his extreme overworking by noting he could not abandon his duties but had to do it all himself to finish quickly. Staring tiredly out the carriage window, he admits that getting home is the only thought keeping him going. His desperate, overwhelming desire to finally see his daughter's face consumes him entirely. Hans softly calls out his lord's name to gently wake him from his deep slumber. Blinking through the haze, Wolfgang looks out the window and realizes they have finally arrived. He rubs his tired eyes and mutters in quiet surprise that he actually managed to fall asleep. Stepping out of the carriage, Wolfgang stares up at the grand manor that feels like a distant memory. He begins to slowly walk toward the imposing front doors of his childhood home. Hans watches with deep concern as his physically exhausted lord nearly trips over his own feet. A perfect line of loyal staff warmly welcomes their master back to the grand estate. Wolfgang silently pushes open the heavy wooden doors to finally enter the magnificent foyer. He stands at attention before his gathered family in the majestic main hall. Kneeling respectfully, Earl Wolfgang Zonta officially reports his successful prevention of the monster stampede. The towering head of the family warmly praises his safe return and congratulates him on a job well done. Marcus smiles brightly and happily welcomes his weary brother back to the manor. Wolfgang chuckles warmly and confirms that he is finally back where he belongs. A tiny, trembling voice suddenly calls out for her father from the sidelines of the hall. Wolfgang immediately turns his head the moment he hears his precious Lulu. Spreading his arms wide with a loving smile, he tenderly announces that he is finally home. A shocked Marcus screams out in sheer horror as Wolfgang's body suddenly goes completely limp. Lulu shrieks her father's name as the utterly exhausted noble dramatically collapses face first onto the marble floor.